Chapter 285. Seeing that the demon-clawed crocodile was about to be pulled into the arms of the twin-headed snake lizard, a scene that surprised Dean and others appeared. The other two demon-clawed crocodiles did not choose to take the opportunity to turn around and run away. Instead, they brazenly pounced on the twin-headed snake lizard, attacking the snakehead that was biting the demon-clawed crocodile, forcing it to loosen its bite. Even if it was a level 27 twin-headed snake lizard, it did not dare to be bitten by the demon-clawed crocodile. This did not mean that the demon-clawed crocodile could bite it to death, but an excellent hunter must learn to hunt with the least amount of damage, so as to ensure that they could survive longer. In the face of three united demon-clawed crocodiles, the twin-headed snake lizard's two heads looked down, flicking out its pink tongue. After a brief confrontation for a few seconds, it pounced on the previous demon-clawed crocodile. The demon-clawed crocodile had just saved its life from the snake's mouth. Seeing two snakeheads pouncing over, it hurriedly opened its mouth to bite one of the snakeheads. However, this snakehead was extremely flexible. The moment it pounced out, it suddenly turned in an arc and bit the forelimb of the demon-clawed crocodile. In the snakehead's mouth were not two sharp fangs, but a row of dense and sharp teeth. After biting the demon-clawed crocodile's forelimb, it fiercely pulled it back. At the same time, its body twisted, rolling and sweeping toward the three demon-clawed crocodiles, immediately disrupting their formation. With a bang, the thick snakehead whipped one of the demon-clawed crocodile, forcing it away. The two snakeheads launched a swift and violent attack, biting and tearing the body of the demon-clawed crocodile. At the same time, its body wrapped around the demon-clawed crocodile's head. The entanglement became tighter and tighter. Its tail kept moving, like a thick snake whip, whipping the other two demon-clawed crocodiles that rushed to help. When the entangled demon-clawed crocodile gradually fell into its meandering body, one of the snakeheads raised, hostile to the other two demon-clawed crocodiles. The atmosphere was extremely tense. The two demon-clawed crocodiles seemed to realize that their companion could not be saved. They gradually lost their fighting spirit and uneasily retreated slowly. On the hill, Dean and others were shocked as they witnessed the primitive monster hunt. When he saw the entangled body of the demon-clawed crocodile being swallowed by one of the snake heads, Dean sobered up and immediately moved the muzzle to the winding body of the twin-headed snake lizard. He did not continue to wait and quickly ignited the line of fire. After a short silence, there was a loud bang. The shell flew out and bombarded the twin-headed snake lizard that was entangled with the demon-clawed crocodile. Boom! With a loud explosion, the body of the twin-headed snake lizard was blasted into a thick smoke. Its skin was torn and its flesh was torn, and its scales were falling. Dean stared at it and suddenly frowned. After the thick smoke, the two-headed snake lizard was badly mutilated by the cannonball, but its body was still tightly wrapped around the demon-clawed crocodile. The cannonball didn't cause any serious injuries, let alone repel it. Instead, after eating the cannonball, its body shrank more tightly. Dean loosened his grip on the cannon and once again held his bow and arrow. He aimed at the target. "Be careful." Gwyneth, who had climbed up the hill, saw Dean's action. She whispered at this moment, "Don't attract its attention, or we won't be able to outrun it." Dean naturally knew this, so after putting the arrow, he did not immediately shoot, but lurked and waited. The sudden attack made the twin-headed snake lizard a little nervous. The two demon-clawed crocodiles that were confronting the twin-headed snake lizard were also a little scared. The violent sound reminded them of the pain in their bodies, and they subconsciously moved further away from the twin-headed snake lizard. The twin-headed snake lizard looked up and quickly found Dean and others on the hill. However, the smell and body shape of these four little people with very little heat didn't attract its attention. After a round of inspection, its eyes fell on the two demon-clawed crocodiles in front of it again. Its tightened body suddenly loosened, and it rushed toward one of the demon-clawed crocodiles. Its attack was extremely abrupt. With the attack of its body, the previously entangled demon-clawed crocodile fell to the ground, raising a lot of dust, but it was motionless. Roar! The demon-clawed crocodile felt the danger and roared in horror, but soon the twin-headed snake lizard got close to it. Dean saw the opportunity and shot an arrow. Whoosh! The arrow flew away, and a ray of silver light nailed the flesh of the twin-headed snake lizard that was previously injured by the explosion. Without the protection of the scales, the arrow easily pierced through. The twin-headed snake lizard screamed in pain, but its offensive didn't stop. The two snake heads shook, and soon the struggling and roaring demon-clawed crocodile was entangled. Its body continued to roll on the ground, sweeping away the other demon-clawed crocodile that was ready to pounce on it. Dean seized the opportunity and quickly shot an arrow. In less than 3 seconds, he had shot out 8 arrows. All of them hit their targets, but 2 of them didn't hit the injured area. Instead, they hit other parts of the body and were easily blocked by the scales. 6 arrows pierced, and the twin-headed snake lizard howled in pain. It wrapped the demon-clawed crocodile more tightly, as if the sound of bones breaking could be heard. Although the extremely hard natural armor of the demon-clawed crocodile could resist hard attacks, it was difficult to bear the squeezing force of the entanglement. Soon blood flowed out of its mouth and eye sockets. The demon-clawed crocodile that was swept away by the twin-headed snake lizard crawled up, but it didn't pounce on it again. Instead, it turned around and fled. The twin-headed snake lizard stared at the direction of its escape and didn't chase. Dean looked at the huge battlefield, and suddenly knew that the next battle was between them and this monster. He immediately shouted to Jean and Scar, "Look at my gesture, get ready to fight!" Jean and Scar hadn't fought yet, but their whole body was drenched in sweat, soaking through their armor. Hearing Dean's words, their beating hearts calmed down a little. They took a deep breath and put their hands on the boulder. Dean quickly shot an arrow. At this moment, there was no demon-clawed crocodile as a night to attract the attention of the twin-headed snake lizard. He could only rely on the prearranged traps and geographical advantages to fight. He didn't flinch. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The arrows pierced through the wind, and in the blink of an eye, they were 100 meters away. Feeling the danger, the twin-headed snake lizard twisted its body and curled up on the ground, covering the previously injured part. With a tinkling sound, the arrows hit its head and body, creating some sparks and bouncing off. However, the arrowheads were broken by the impact, and the mercury inside splashed out like silver teardrops, sliding into the gaps between the scales. Dean stopped when there were only 2 arrows left in the quiver. It was not that he intended to use the 2 arrows for anything, but it was a habit to keep a hand in case of emergency. The twin-headed snake saw that the arrows had stopped, so it roared and crawled toward the hill. "Attack!" Dean shouted. Scar and Jean quickly pushed the boulder. Rumble! The boulder rolled down the slope of the hill with great momentum. The twin-headed snake lizard saw the boulder rolling over, so it twisted its body very flexibly and narrowly escaped from the boulder. At this time, Scar and Jean had moved the second boulder and pushed it down. The twin-headed snake lizard was blocked under the hill. Dean frowned as he saw this scene. The speed of the boulder rolling was too slow. There was no hope of hurting the double-headed snake. Gwyneth also saw this. Her face was pale as she looked at Dean. "We should withdraw. We won't be able to leave if it comes up." Dean whispered, "Don't worry." Gwyneth's face turned ugly as she stared at the boy who was almost the same age as her. "Do you have any other way? It's not something we can fight against." Dean didn't speak as he stared at the twin-headed snake lizard under the hill. 4 boulders were quickly pushed down. Scar and Jean looked at the unscathed twin-headed snake. Their faces were pale as they forgot to breathe. They rushed to Dean. "What should we do now?" Dean's fingers slightly clenched as he stared at the bottom of the hill. The twin-headed snake immediately swam over as it saw that the boulder was gone. It wanted to climb up the hill. Suddenly, boom! There was a loud noise as the whole hill shook. Lao Jean almost lost his balance and fell. They only heard a shrill roar coming from the bottom of the hill. It was extremely sharp, and they hurriedly looked down, only to find that the body of the twin-headed snake lizard had fallen on the ground. Under the hill where it had passed, there was a huge pit with thick smoke billowing. Gwyneth and the other two were stunned as they saw the pit. They suddenly remembered that this was the place where they buried the mineral powder yesterday. Dean frowned and glanced at the twin-headed snake lizard's whole body. He saw that in the middle of its 4 claws, there was a huge hole in its abdomen, which was bleeding. However, this hole could only be regarded as a serious injury compared to the size of its whole body. It would be much easier to hunt if I had a catapult, Dean thought in his heart. But he didn't have such tools at the moment. He looked at Gwyneth. Prepare fire attack. Gwyneth was startled as she saw the twin-headed snake get seriously injured. She heard Dean's words and thought of the plan to force the monsters out of the basin. She immediately understood and left. Sergei ran up from the back of the hill after she left. He looked at Dean in excitement. It's incredible! It's just a small fire, but it's able to erupt with such terrifying power. Dean smiled. The lead of the black gunpowder buried in the ground had been extended to other places. It was the primitive use of landmines in the early days of the birth of the black fire. He said, "It's injured. We just have to kill it. Don't let its wound heal." Sergei nodded. He suddenly thought of something. The smell of blood should attract some interested prey. We have to finish it quickly, or else. Dean's eyes narrowed. It was very difficult to kill the twin-headed snake with current strategies and tools. He said, "Cooperate with Gwyneth and use fire to hunt it." Sergei's eyes lit up. Fire attack? Good idea. Chapter 286. Sergei, Jean and Scar went down the hill one after another. They were going to arrange the final killers. Dean stood on the hill, monitoring the movement of the twin-headed snake lizard. Perhaps because the wound was too big, it did not try to climb up, but softly collapsed on the ground, twisting its body weakly. It seemed to be dying and would not live for long. However, Dean had seen the cunning side of these monsters in the past. He didn't believe in such appearances. Whether it was true or false, he only believed in the real dead things. Very soon, a cluster of flames suddenly ignited in the weeds surrounding the open space. In the dense grass, this cluster of flames had just appeared, and it quickly spread to the surroundings like a prairie fire. The fire spread at an astonishing speed, and black smoke billowed, covering the sky above the prairie. The blazing heat wave swept over from the burning prairie, and the smell of ashes could be faintly smelled in the air. The surrounding open space under the hill was instantly turned into a sea of fire. The twin-headed snake seemed to be afraid of fire as it shrank its body. Dean saw the squirming of its body. He was convinced that the injury wasn't as serious as it looked. He pulled out the iron arrow and aimed at its eyes. Whoosh! The arrows fell like rain. The twin-headed snake's head swayed from side to side to avoid the arrows. Many arrows hit the protruding cuticle on its head but were resisted. They didn't cause any damage. In the blink of an eye, more than a dozen arrows were shot but none of them penetrated its body. All of them were blocked by the scales. Dean's face was gloomy. His arrows were powerful enough to leave a dent on the steel plate within 100 meters. But they didn't leave a scar on the scales of the twin-headed snake. It showed how hard the structure of the scales was and how delicate the internal particle distribution was. No wonder the bodies of the monsters are collected. Some of the monsters' limbs can be made into perfect weapons. They are stronger than the materials made by humans. Moreover, they are pure natural. Dean put away the longbow and turned to the bottom of the hill. He found 2 boulders and pushed them to the top of the hill. Looking at the twin-headed snake lizard that was still entrenched below, he immediately threw the boulders toward it. Whoosh! The boulder fell like the wind. The twin-headed snake lizard's entrenched body was suddenly shocked, and it hurriedly moved, narrowly avoiding the falling point of the boulder. However, its tail was crushed by the subsequent rolling, and the snake body swayed in pain, sweeping the boulder into the sea of fire and weeds outside the open space. Dean continued to lift the boulder and throw it. At this time, he deeply felt the lack of tools. People could fight with the sky, the earth, and the beast. They relied on tools, and tools were the crystallization of human wisdom. It was the unique strength of human beings. Whoosh! The second boulder was thrown, and the twin-headed snake lizard twisted its body to avoid it again. Sergei and others returned to the hill. Dudian asked Gwyneth and Sergei to find boulders to throw. Facing a level 27 monster, even if it was heavily injured, it would be extremely risky for him to engage in melee combat. If he were to be dragged down by it before it died, it would be too much of a loss. Gwyneth and Sergei heard Dudian's words and immediately agreed. At the same time they secretly cursed him for being cunning. Gwyneth and Sergei joined the team. Dudian and the two of them lifted the boulder and threw it. 3 boulders fell at the same time. The twin-headed snake lizard was shocked and angry. It didn't expect to meet such a shameless enemy. It struggled to twist its body. Although it still had a lot of strength, the hole in its abdomen was too big. It was extremely inconvenient for it to move. It couldn't dodge in time and was hit in the back of its tail by one of the boulders. The pain made its body tense up. It quickly retreated and crawled out of the hill. However, there was a jungle fire outside. Although many of the weeds had been burned to ashes, but many of them were green weeds. They burned slowly, but the fire was still strong. It didn't dare to step into the fire circle. It tried to stay away from Dudian and others. It's too far. Sergei looked at the position of the twin-headed snake lizard. He wanted to give up. Dudian immediately said, "Let's change to a smaller size." Sergei couldn't help but smile. Jean and Scar were responsible for looking for boulders. The 3 of them acted as human catapults. They kept throwing boulders. Bang, bang, bang. Every time the 3 of them threw boulders at the same time. The twin-headed snake was struggling to dodge. Every time a boulder or even 2 boulders would hit its body. It didn't take long for the twin-headed snake's body to be covered with scars. Every boulder that fell would break its scales. The ground was covered with blood after dozens of boulders were thrown at the twin-headed snake. However, the weeds on the periphery of the open space had been burned to ashes. The temperature was relatively hot, but the flames were extinguished. The twin-headed snake lizard immediately shrank into these burning weed. Some of its exposed wounds were burned by the hot grass root. It was so painful that it writhed uncomfortably. Dudian looked at Sergei and Gwyneth as he saw the twin-headed snake run further and further away. "Get ready. We have to fight in close combat." Gwyneth and Sergei were shocked. Although the twin-headed snake was seriously injured by the boulders, its terrifying body still had a strong momentum. However, seeing Dean's determined eyes, the 2 knew that there was no room for discussion. Their eyes flashed and they silently agreed. Dudian took the lead and slid down the hill to catch up with the twin-headed snake. Jean and Scar turned back and looked at the back of the 3. They knew that they wouldn't be of any help. They silently prayed on the hill. Dudian quickly caught up with the twin-headed snake. He pulled out his bow and shot an arrow to attract its attention. The arrow hit one of the wounds where the boulder had rubbed off its scales. The sharp pain made the 2-headed snake lizard notice Dean. Instead of retreating, it launched a counterattack. 2 snake heads fiercely rushed toward Dean, its 4 limbs crawling on the ground. Dudian was surprised as he didn't expect it to have such speed. He quickly retreated and shouted at Sergei and Gwyneth, "I'll attract its attention. You attack from the left and right." Sergei and Gwyneth immediately separated from each other. Their eyes were like torches as they pulled out their long spears and swords. They tentatively attacked the twin-headed snake lizard from both sides. The twin-headed snake swept its tail so that they didn't dare to get close to it. Dudian looked at the 2 as he retreated. He saw their timid appearance. He knew that they didn't really want to attack. They were trying to avoid getting injured while obeying orders. He was angry, but he knew that there was nothing he could do. He gave up the attack and turned around to run back to the hill. The twin-headed snake chased after Dudian. Its speed was greatly reduced as it saw Dudian step into the hill. Its two heads were full of vigilance. It seemed that the boulder attack had left a big shadow on it. Dean also stopped as he saw that Sergei and Gwyneth didn't want to attack with all their strength. He quickly thought of other ways to deal with it. He shouted to both of them, "You guys hold it here. I'll go find help." Sergei and Gwyneth were puzzled. They didn't wait for them to ask as they saw Dudian turn around and leave. If they didn't know that Dudian had no reason to harm them, they would have thought that Dudian was getting cold feet. Help? Where to find? Sergei's heart moved as he had a guess. Dean followed the smell of smell and quickly ran in one direction. Soon after he crossed 7 or 8 miles, he finally saw a wandering figure. It was the sickle walking dead, and it was the mutated sickle walking dead that he had hunted last time. It was extremely huge. Dudian didn't look back as he turned around and ran away. The mutated sickle undead roared as it chased after Dudian. Dudian returned to the place where the twin-headed snake was. Gwyneth and Sergei were harassing the twin-headed snake from time to time. They cooperated with each other to contain each other so that the twin-headed snake wouldn't attack the other person. Seeing Dean come back, the two of them were a little relieved. Then they heard a roar coming from behind Dean. They immediately saw a huge human with a hideous face and a sharp sickle in its arms. "Hide!" Dean roared. "You continue to contain him. I will continue to look for help." Gwyneth and Sergei, who were retreating, were stunned as they heard Dudian's words. They didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Although it was a very simple method, it didn't mean that it was ineffective. In such a crisis, no one would think of such a method. Even if they thought of it, they wouldn't have the courage to do it. After all, they couldn't deal with one monster. How could they attract other monsters? Dean ran to the double-headed snake lizard and immediately went to the nearby ash grasses. He shook off the sickle undead and ran straight to the back of the double-headed snake lizard. The route was like a C shape, and in the middle of the C was the double-headed snake lizard. Chapter 287. Dudian left the place without looking back. According to the smell of the monster, he continued to look for the next monster. Time passed by. Dudian ran back and forth. In the blink of an eye, he had attracted 6 nearby sickle zombies. Whenever he came to the front of the double-headed snake lizard, he saw that the sickle walking dead that was attracted had fallen to the ground. Its body was bitten off, leaving only its lower body. Some even disappeared directly. They were swallowed by this behemoth. He secretly felt sorry and distressed that the cold crystal in the head of the walking dead was lost like this. In addition to the sickle zombies, Dudian tried to lure other monsters. He ran over and observed from afar. He confirmed that it wasn't a monster that he couldn't handle. Then he lured the monsters to the front of the double-headed snake lizard. Sickle zombies, spider worms, forest bloodwolves. Dudian lured monsters back. The highest level of monster wasn't more than level 20. The young lizard was the highest level monster. It was rated as level 18 in the Monster Atlas. It lived in the swamp. If it wasn't for the previous basin swamp being occupied by the magic claw crocodiles, it would have become the world of the young lizard. The double-headed snake lizard had more and more wounds under the attacks of Dudian, especially in the battle with the spider worms. Although the spider worms were level 15 and Dudian could kill them in a head-on confrontation, but they were very rare and troublesome monsters. They were highly toxic, and the spider silk they spat out contained deadly venom. Monsters that were higher than the spider worms didn't dare to easily hunt them. Although the double-headed snake lizard had successfully killed the spider worms, but it was entangled by the venom, especially the parts where the scales had fallen off. The venom spread extremely fast, which led to serious injuries in the battle with the young lizard and forest bloodwolf. "It's our turn." Dudian looked at the dying double-headed snake lizard in front of him. He didn't continue to lure the monsters. In fact, there weren't many monsters around to lure. He had to walk a long distance to lure the windog. Moreover, the double-headed snake lizard had gone through a series of battles, so it was very weak. Even if it had the power to fight back, Dudian believed that he, Sergei and Gwyneth would be able to kill it. In fact, if Gwyneth and Sergei were in their peak state, they would be able to kill the double-headed snake lizard. Let's go. Sergei looked at the twin-headed snake lizard that was lying in a pool of blood and slightly twisting its body. His eyes flashed with excitement as he held his spear and took the lead to approach step by step. Gwyneth no longer held back. Now, the two-headed snake lizard was like a tiger with its teeth pulled out. It had lost its deterrent power. Dean was panting as he had consumed a lot of physical energy. He was waiting for Sergei and Gwyneth to pin him down. Ha! Sergei shouted and rushed out with his spear. He stabbed the wound on the body of the twin-headed snake lizard. The pain made the twin-headed snake lizard writhing weakly on the ground roar in pain. The two snake heads that were fighting fiercely lifted up from the ground and pounced towards Sergei. Sergei's face slightly changed. He quickly pulled out his gun and retreated. Gwyneth quickly attacked from the other side, stabbing her sword at the other side of the twin-headed snake lizard, causing one of the snake heads to turn around and bite her. Dean saw the opportunity and shot an arrow. With a puff, the sharp arrow pierced through the lower jaw of the snake's head, where it had been bitten by the forest blood wolf. Although the sharp arrow was extremely inconspicuous compared to its size, the damage it caused the snake's head to roar in pain. Gwyneth seized the opportunity and quickly continued to attack. Dean continued to shoot. The efficiency of the hunting team was maximized at this moment. The weakened twin-headed snake lizard attacked several times to no avail. Its physical strength was gradually exhausted. One of the snake heads softened as Gwyneth's sword cut through the wound. A lot of blood sputtered out. After a few minutes, the twin-headed snake finally died. Both of its heads were cut off, but its tail was still gently rolling behind it. The ground was full of blood, and the smell of blood filled the air. The three of them were relieved. Although they were tired, their hearts were full of excitement. Dean gasped and looked at Sergei. "Are you okay?" Sergei shook his head as he covered the wound on his shoulder. "It's nothing." Sergei was careless when the twin-headed snake's head hit him. Although he used his spear to block the attack, but his shoulder was injured. Dean retracted his gaze. "Pack up the things and get ready to leave. The smell is so strong that it will attract other monsters." After that, he came to the corpse of the demon spider worm near him. Its bulging body was pierced by the sharp claws of the twin-headed snake lizard, and the intestines and green gastric juices flowed out of its abdomen, filling the ground with an unpleasant stench. Dean took out his dagger and cut off the valuable tissues from its body. Now that he was an architect of the Temple of Elements, he could study these materials and make them into useful hunting items. These monsters were huge. Although many of their bodies were destroyed during the battle, but many of their precious organs and parts were preserved. Dudian and Sergei cut them off. Gwyneth didn't know anything about these things. She looked at the two of them who were rummaging through the bodies of the monsters. There was a trace of unspeakable feeling in her heart. In the past, she looked down on these bloody people. However, most of the things that lived inside the giant wall were brought back from outside the giant wall by these people. Moreover, they had to fight with such monsters in order to obtain these things. Gwyneth silently stood in the pool of blood. It was impossible to see what she was thinking. After 10 minutes, Dean and Sergei had cut off all the materials from the monsters. The most precious ones were the spider silk sac of the spider monster and the sharp fangs of the young swamp lizard. Although the twin-headed snake lizard was big and had a high hunting level, but the most valuable parts were the scales and claws on its skull. The other parts weren't of high value and were heavy to carry. Dean cut its stomach, and suddenly a large amount of gastric juices and digestive fluids were everywhere. It was extremely ugly. Among them, there were the shadows of several sickle zombies. Their skin had been burned by the gastric juices and was mottled like rotten and rusty iron. Dean endured the strange smell as he fished out their bodies. He cut open their skulls and took out the cold crystals inside. Gwyneth frowned as she smelled the pungent smell. She looked at the cold crystals in Dean's hand. What is this? A gem? The raw material of God's blessing. Dean looked at her and slowly said. Gwyneth was startled. She felt that the gastric juice was rolling. Although there was no mirror, she could feel that her face was incomparably ugly. The raw material of God's blessing? Was it made from this thing? Dean nodded and put away the cold crystals. Gwyneth knew that Dean wouldn't lie to her, so her face turned uglier. She didn't expect that the thing that gave her strength and was called God's blessing would be made from the body of such an ugly monster. It felt like a perfect gold item was desecrated by a dirty and ugly black object. However, she wasn't an innocent little girl after spending time in prison. Although it was hard to accept, but she wouldn't doubt the truth of the matter. Dean gathered all the items together and was ready to go back to get the storage bag. Suddenly he heard footsteps. He looked back and saw the blonde Jean running towards him. His face was full of panic. Dean's heart skipped a beat as he rushed over. What's the matter? Jean shouted in panic. Dean, it's not good. Blackie was dragged away by something. What? Dean was startled. Why didn't you help him? I helped, but old Hay told me to go. He said that I couldn't deal with that thing. Moreover, that thing was too fast. I couldn't catch up with it. Jean said anxiously. Dean, please help old Hay. I beg you. Dean saw the anxiety on Jin's face. He thought about the friendship they had in prison. He knew that Jean wasn't a coward. He used his sense of smell to track. Which direction? Behind the hill, go straight up. Old Jean hastily said. Dean looked back at Sergei and Gwyneth. You guys clean up the place and wait for me at the entrance of the passage. I'll go with you, Sergei said. No. Dudian refused, as it would expose his sense of smell. Moreover, Sergei was injured and couldn't use much of his strength. Gwyneth was exhausted. Although she was stronger than Sergei, but the number of steel nails nailed to her joints had greatly affected her combat effectiveness. She wouldn't be of any help if she followed them. Chapter 288. Whoosh! The whistling wind passed through his ears. Dean sprinted all the way like a gecko up the hill, following the direction of the smell. It didn't take long for him to see some spattered blood on the weed. He couldn't tell if it was Scars or the unknown monsters. His eyes were gloomy as he clenched his fist. He crossed the weeds, the skeletons of the giant monster, and the ruins of the collapsed buildings. When he smelled the smell of Scar and the unknown monster in front of him, his heart was relieved. It meant that his speed was getting closer to the other side. He immediately maintained full speed and chased all the way. After 7 or 8 minutes, Dean finally saw a 4 or 5 meters tall shadow jumping and running in front of him. It was a reptilian beast. It looked like a wolf, but its whole body was covered with green scales, mixed with fine black spots. There was a tuft of sharp hair on the top of its head, like a steel needle floating backward. Its limbs were thick and its tail was long and thin. It was like a rope swinging behind its buttocks. Although he was standing at the back, Dean could still see that the thing was holding something in its mouth. Its 2 arms were shaking up and down as it ran. Scar! Dean's pupils shrank. His eyes flashed with killing intent. He quickly grabbed the bow and arrow, stabilizing his upper body while running. He aimed at a certain part of the body. Whoosh! The arrow rushed out and fiercely stabbed into the butt of the monster's tail. The monster felt pain and jumped a few meters high. It stopped in the grass in front of him and turned to look at Dean. Dean immediately saw the person in its mouth. It was Scar. At the moment, he seemed to be unconscious. His body unconsciously swayed along with the monster's head. Beast! Dean's heart was filled with great anger. When he saw Scar, he also recognized the monster. It was called the poisonous spot dog. It lived in the jungle area and had high potential. It liked to live in small groups. It was an extremely cunning monster. Just like the fox in the old era, the poisonous spot dog had such an impression in the hearts of hunters. However, although the poisonous spot dog was cunning, its hunting level was not high. In adulthood, it could only reach level 14. Its combat ability was equivalent to that of an intermediate hunter. The dog looked at Dean with hostility. Its nasal cavity issued a low growl, but its mouth was still tightly biting Black Scar. Dean couldn't bear it anymore. He quickly aimed and shot. Seeing Dean's posture, the dog reacted quickly. However, it did not jump to avoid the arrow, but raised its head. Puff! The arrow pierced into Scar's leg that it was holding in its mouth. When Dean saw this scene, he felt like the blood in his body was about to burst. His eyes flashed with monstrous killing intent. He pulled out the dagger from his waist and rushed over. The dog loosened its mouth and threw Scar to the ground. It bent its limbs on the ground and made a pouncing posture. Dean saw its appearance and immediately prepared to defend. Both of them were about 6 meters away from each other, and both launched a sprint attack. When he saw the spotted hound rushing towards him, Dean instantly made a defensive posture with one hand while the other hand was ready to stab the dog's abdomen. However, in the next moment, the poison-spotted hound's 4 limbs suddenly changed direction. It turned around and swept its tail horizontally like a whip. As it swung, the air let out a loud whistling sound. Dean's pupils shrank. He hurriedly bent down to evade. Whoosh! The tail swept the weeds next to him. Suddenly, the weeds were cut off. The lethality was as amazing as a Zamadeo. The moment Dudian crouched on the ground, he rushed toward the dog. His dagger fiercely stabbed at the dog's neck. The poisonous spot dog didn't seem to think that its sneak attack would fail. It was surprised, but its body reacted quickly. It quickly jumped back to evade, but its speed was not as fast as Dean. Immediately, Dean's dagger stabbed the scales on its chest. The poisonous spot dog growled and opened its mouth to bite. It stopped and retreated to counterattack Dean. "Get lost!" Dean roared and punched from the side. The dog's head was smashed to the side. At the same time, the dagger in his hand fiercely stabbed into the scales on its chest. The scales were extremely soft and tough. The dagger was pushed by Dean with all his strength before it pierced into the hilt. The poisonous spot dog roared in pain. Its limbs violently struggled and madly stomped on the ground. Dean couldn't catch its smooth body. As soon as he pulled away, it turned around and ran away. Dean was about to chase, but suddenly thought of Black Scar. He stopped and quickly turned back. He saw Black Scar lying in the weeds. His face was as pale as paper. He seemed to be in a coma. However, there was a huge bite mark on his neck. It silently told his condition. The carotid artery had been bitten. Dean's pupils shrank. He clenched his fists and slowly squatted down. He reached out and pressed on Black Scar's chest. He didn't feel a heartbeat. The huge bite mark on the carotid artery almost made half of Black Scar's neck fall off. Obviously, Black Scar would not survive. Caca. Dean's fingers made a soft sound. He clenched his teeth. His heart was full of remorse. He didn't expect that one of the 5 people would die in the first time they came out. Although he expected that the outside of the giant wall would be extremely dangerous, he still underestimated the dangerous living environment here. His sense of smell wasn't excellent. His sense of smell wasn't as efficient as his hearing and vision. He had bailed them out of prison. He was ready to let them follow him to do big things. They trusted him so much. He didn't expect that they would encounter such a thing in the first time they came out of the giant wall. Dean clenched his teeth. He put Black Scar's eyes and picked up Black Scar's body. Suddenly, his nose slightly sniffed. His face slightly changed. Then a strong murderous aura gushed out from his dark eyes. Slowly, he put Black Scar back to the ground. Dean pulled out a dagger from his leg and turned around. His eyes were full of murderous aura as he stared at the grass. Rustle! 8 figures ran briskly from the jungle. They were similar in size. They were 8 poisonous spotted dogs. One of them in the middle had a dagger stuck in its chest. Blood had stopped oozing out. It was the dog that had previously fled. At this moment, a pair of dark red eyes were coldly staring at Dean. Dean's eyes were full of anger and ferocity. Dean's eyes swept over the 8 poisonous spotted dogs one by one. He only felt that the cold blood in his body was boiling and freezing. His heart was full of killing intent. Although he knew that he was at a disadvantage and was likely to die, but behind him was Black Scar's body. He remembered that when he was in prison, Black Scar had talked about his dream of hunting. I used to hope that after I died, there would be someone to collect my body and bring me back to the giant wall. Let me die a human's death, instead of exposing my corpse in the wilderness and feeding it to these beasts. Now I'm locked up here, so I don't have to worry. These mocking words and expressions had not been forgotten in his heart even after several years. Black Scar was brought out by himself. Now that he was dead, his body must be brought back by himself. This was his only thought at the moment. The weak fire in his heart that was about to be extinguished seemed to burn into a vigorous flame at this moment, burning his brain. His always calm judgment and the most beneficial choice were engulfed by the flame. Anger. Feeling the strong killing intent in Dean's eyes, the 8 poisonous spotted dogs did not rush to attack. Instead, they scattered and surrounded Dean in a circle. This was their habitual way of fighting when hunting in group. After the encirclement was established, the 8 poisonous spotted dogs growled in a low voice and responded to each other. For a time, the dogs howled like wolves and dogs howled one after another, full of awe-inspiring momentum. Dean clenched the dagger and stared at the poisonous spotted dog that had killed Black Scar. Seeing that the war was about to break out, the 8 dogs that surrounded Dean suddenly stopped howling. They looked around, and the stable and firm encirclement seemed to be in a commotion. Dean frowned and sniffed. Suddenly, he smelled a very light smell approaching. Was it another monster? Oh. The 8 poisonous spotted dogs suddenly looked at the left side of the jungle and seemed to perceive something. The encirclement that had just been formed suddenly collapsed, and they ran in the opposite direction without looking back. They did not even look at Dean. Dean's face was gloomy. A monster that could make the 8 cunning poisonous spotted dogs run away was most likely a large monster that was above level 20. He put away the dagger and quickly turned around to pick up Black Scar. Just as he was about to run away, a shadow suddenly ejected from the grass nearby and fell more than 10 meters in front of him. Dean's pupils shrank as he saw the giant shadow jump out. Scar, who was in his arms, was almost scared out of his wits. It turned out to be an extremely strange monster. It looked like a giant praying mantis, but the difference was that it didn't walk upright. Instead, it was like a twisted seaweed. Its whole body was in the shape of a sickle. Just from its appearance, one could see its terrifying combat effectiveness. The moment he saw this thing, Dean felt that his mind was a bit blank. Although it was the first time he had seen it, its appearance had left a very deep impression in his mind. It was one of the 8 legendary monsters recorded in the Monster Atlas, and this was one of them, the Splitter. Chapter 289. Dean was completely dumbfounded. He held Scar and stood on the spot. Even his heartbeat stopped. The distorted and ferocious figure appeared in front of Dean like a bolt from the blue. Dean's mind was in chaos. Even if it was a level 30 monster, he could more or less arouse some desire to fight back. But this legendary monster was like the darkness that overwhelmed him, making him feel an irresistible sense of suffocation. Splitter looked down at the little ant in front of him. Without much pause, it swept out. 7 or 8 sickle-like limbs swept towards Dean. Puff, puff, puff. It was as fast as lightning. Dean only felt a gust of wind hitting his face. His body and mind had no time to react. He felt his whole body flying backward, followed by severe pain from all over his body. Dean's brain buzzed. The scenery in front of him rotated rapidly. It turned 720 degrees. Then his body was dragged by severe pain. He fell straight down to a dark place. A strong smell of blood assailed his nostrils. The next moment, his body was caught in a violent jolt. His internal organs were tumbling. His stomach acid seemed to shake. He coughed out a few mouthfuls of blood. At this time, Dean's consciousness recovered a little. His mind gradually became clear in this violent jolt. His first reaction was that he was not dead. He turned his head and looked around. The dark space did not affect his vision. Suddenly, he saw a horrifying scene from hell. He was surrounded by a pool of blood and corpses. All kinds of twisted and weird limbs were scattered around him. There were also a few twisted and hideous heads staring at him in the darkness. With a violent jolt, one of the lizard heads rolled down. In this jungle ruins there were many jungle lizards. They were one of the most common monsters. Where is this? Dean felt the violent jolt. He looked around blankly. He looked up at the faint light above him. He saw a jagged carapace. His heart was filled with a creepy feeling. Was he in the mouth of the splitter? As soon as this idea emerged, another question appeared. If this was the mouth, why was it not chewing but hoarding the corpses of other monsters in its mouth? Could it be that its eating habit was to accumulate a certain amount of food before swallowing it all at once? No matter where he was, it was not a good thing for him. Suddenly, he thought of Scar. He looked down and saw that his hand was no longer there. He looked around and soon saw the corpse of Scar lying among the remains of the monsters. However, he was missing an arm and a thigh. There was also a clear wound on his chest. The incision was neat. It was obvious that it was done by Splitter. Dean suddenly recalled the previous scene. He looked down at his body and felt a sharp pain coming from his abdomen. A finger-long wound had cut through the hunter's armor. Blood was slowly seeping out of it, but he didn't feel much pain. It should be because of the paralysis toxin on Splitter's blade. Apart from his abdomen, there was also a huge wound on his left shoulder, almost cutting off his entire arm. Seeing such a serious injury, Dean hurriedly touched the back of his waist bag. There was a portable first aid kit. He quickly untied the first aid kit and took out gauze and disinfectant from inside. He wanted to bandage the wound. Suddenly, the previous jolt became violent and threw him to the ground. His cheek collided with a monster's severed limb. His face was stained with sticky blood. It smelled fishy and stinky. Dean was shocked. He quickly hung up the first aid kit. Both of his hands were on the pile of corpses. He was like a frog trying to stabilize his body. At the same time, he nervously looked at the serrated organ above him. The other monsters' corpses around him were shaking. Some of their intestines were thrown out and hung on his neck. It was cold and slippery. It was full of pungent smell. Roar. At the same time, he seemed to hear panicked roars and shrill screams from outside. Dean's nervous heart relaxed a bit. He immediately speculated that Splitter was not preparing to eat but was preying on other monsters. Soon, the serrated organ above him quickly opened. Several huge elephant-like figures fell from the sky. Dean was shocked. He quickly crawled to the side to avoid it. Otherwise, he would be smashed to death if he was hit by it. Bang! Bang! Several huge shadows fell down and hit Dean's original position. The corpses of the other monsters that were already dead were smashed. Scar's corpse was also hit by one of the huge shadows. Blood sputtered in all directions. Scar's corpse was submerged in the blood. Most of it had turned into meat paste and was unrecognizable. This made Dean's face extremely ugly. His determination to bring back Scar's body was ruthlessly crushed at this moment. He suddenly had a very clear understanding that in the absence of strength, tenacious willpower and decisive confidence were just empty talk, just a joke. At this time, the sawtooth-like organ quickly closed up, and the original degree of turbulence appeared again. Although Dean couldn't see the situation outside, but he could roughly guess that the splitter should be in a hurry from the bumpy reaction. Dean quietly breathed a sigh of relief. He looked at the huge shadows and found out that they were the poisonous spotted dogs. However, not all of them were caught. There were only 4 of them. 4 treacherous and cunning poisonous spotted dogs were killed by Splitter in less than 2 breaths. Every poisonous spotted dog had a fatal wound. There were many sharp scars all over its body. At this time, the jolt suddenly stopped. Many monsters' corpses and Dean rolled over. Dean bumped into another monster's body. His whole body was stained with blood. Soon, the serrated organ opened again and a huge black shadow was thrown in. It was a poisonous spotted dog. This time, Dean saw a sharp sickle skewered its body and accurately threw it into the room. Dean was secretly shocked. It seemed that these poisonous spotted dogs couldn't escape from Splitter. Just as he had guessed, the next few dogs were thrown in one after another. One of them was still alive and had not been fatally injured. However, there were several large wounds on its body, which made it difficult for it to move in this enclosed environment. Dean stared at it, and it also noticed Dean, a living creature. 1 man and 1 dog looked at each other. No one dared to make a sound. The jolt continued. Other monsters were thrown in from outside the serrated organ. Some of them were large monsters with extremely high hunting level. These large monsters had many fatal wounds. They were on the verge of death after being thrown in. Some of them were already dead. In addition, there were also scythe-wielding zombies. After these scythe-wielding zombies landed on the ground, they immediately bit the flesh on the ground. But it didn't take long for them to be smashed by the monsters' corpses thrown in from behind. As more and more monsters' corpses were thrown in, the dark sealed space became more and more crowded. The smell of blood was getting stronger. Dean was getting more and more nervous. He constantly adjusted his position to avoid being smashed by the monsters. At the same time, he was being careful. He felt that when the volume of the monsters' corpses was full, he would face the moment of death. That was his last hope to escape. He didn't even have any hope. The poisonous spotted dog in front of him had already been smashed to death by the monsters that were thrown in from behind. Dean didn't feel happy to see the cunning monster die. Instead, he felt a bit sad. In front of the absolute ruler of the jungle, all creatures were food. Soon, the monsters' corpses were piled up. Dean adjusted his position and hid at the edge of the serrated organ. He quietly waited for an opportunity. Just as he expected, when this place was full, the bumps were constant, and there were no more violent fluctuations. For a long time, there were no more corpses of monsters being thrown into this place. Obviously, this Splitter knew that it was full, and the next thing to do was to return to its nest. Dean was nervous, but there was a trace of fear in his heart. He suddenly thought that the season was about to enter the black snow season. In the old era, the beasts were used to collect prey in advance and hoard it in the cave. Some cold-blooded animals would simply have a full meal in advance and then go into hibernation. Perhaps this was the behavior of the Splitter. It hunted so many monsters but didn't eat them on the spot. Instead, it hoarded them. It was obvious that it was preparing for the black snow season. In this dark and fishy place, Dean was lying on the corpse of a scaled monster. Countless thoughts were running through his mind. Chapter 290. In this silent darkness, Dean quietly lurked. Every minute and second felt like a century. He wished that the bumps would continue like this forever, but he knew that there would be a moment when he had to face it. He didn't continue to shiver and wait for death. He suddenly thought that if he went to its nest, all the food here would be poured out. He was now on the surface, but when the food was poured out, he would be pressed to the bottom. With the tonnage of these monsters, he estimated that he would be buried alive. Thinking of this, his heart moved. He took out the dagger on his leg and rummaged through the wreckage of these monsters. Soon, he found the corpse of a demon claw crocodile. This demon claw crocodile was still stained with mud. It should not be the 3 he killed. It should be the one in the basin swamp. Even if it hid in its own swamp territory, It was still difficult to escape the hunting of the splitter. Dean used the dagger to cut the huge crack in its abdomen. He struggled to cut open the wound a little bit and pulled out the internal organs and other organs inside. Then he turned around and stuck his back to the crocodile and stuffed his body inside. His hands tightly grasped the flesh at the edge of the wound, waiting nervously. 10 minutes later, the bumps gradually slowed down. Dean's body was tense and extremely nervous. The moment of life and death had arrived. When the bumps completely stopped, it didn't take long for the serrated organs above to loosen. Dean thought that the splitter would turn over and fall, but suddenly he felt a huge force arching from the bottom up, pushing out the many monster wreckage below and falling down. Bang! The demon claw crocodile's corpse that was wrapped around Dean also fell, heavily hitting the ground, making Dean feel a burst of pain in his bones. Then more monster corpses poured down. Banging sounds continued. Blood, internal organs, intestines, and other organs spilled out and smashed on the corpse of the demon claw crocodile. When the corpse of a poisonous spotted dog smashed down, Dean felt like being hit by a boulder and almost suffocated. Fortunately, the cuticle on the back of the demon claw crocodile had evolved into a sophisticated armor. It had a strong defense and shock absorption effect, which protected Dean from being crushed on the spot. Soon, the monster corpses were dumped and piled up into a mountain of corpses that exuded a strong stench. Blood seeped from the layers of corpses and soaked the ground. The world was silent. Dean felt that his whole body was extremely heavy, and he was almost out of breath. Fortunately, there was still thin air between the corpses, otherwise he would have suffocated to death. Nevertheless, after a few continuous gasps, most of the oxygen had been absorbed by his lungs. The speed of the flow of oxygen from the outside was not as fast as his body's consumption. Dean didn't dare to make a sound. His whole body was tense. He was afraid that the splitter would swallow all the food. Although he had guessed that the probability was very low, but there was no 100% certainty in this world. Even if there was only a 10% chance of a mistake, it would make people very nervous. Dean tried hard to tilt his head and put his ear on the inside of the belly of the magic claw crocodile. The sticky flesh was intimately attached to his ear, listening to the movement outside the mountain of corpses. A few minutes later, he heard the slight trembling of the ground. The frequency was extremely high, and then it quickly weakened. Suddenly, he thought of a possibility. The splitter had left this place and went out to hunt again. Thinking of this, Dean's nervous heart was suddenly relieved. He didn't dare to continue to wait. He seized this rare opportunity and struggled hard to break open the body of the magic claw crocodile with both hands, wanting to climb out. However, after pushing a few times, Dean's heart sank. The weight of the magic claw crocodile's body was far heavier than he had imagined. It was like a whole mountain was pressing on it. Damn it! In this dark and sealed place, Dean was a little anxious. The splitter would hoard enough food to pass the winter and would not leave again. Once it noticed a living creature like him, it would be difficult to escape death. The only opportunity was in front of him. Was it going to be buried like this? He gritted his teeth and pushed with all his strength, but it was still difficult to push even a little bit. There was a trace of fear in the anxiety and anger in his heart. He did not give up. After pushing for a moment, he suddenly thought of another method. He immediately crawled forward into the body of the magic claw crocodile and drilled into its mouth. Under the lubrication of the viscous blood and Dean's own strength, he quickly moved his body. This made him feel a trace of joy in his heart and more motivated. Soon, he climbed to the neck of the magic claw crocodile. There was a huge sharp wound caused by the splitter, which was also the fatal wound that killed the magic claw crocodile. Dean grabbed the wound and squeezed his body into its upper body's mouth. He struggled to push its upper jaw, but there was no effect. The hope that had just been ignited in his heart was once again smashed to the bottom. He gasped deeply, his whole body drenched in sweat. In the sealed place, The thin air made his physical strength weaker and weaker. He felt exhausted and wanted to lie down and sleep, but in the end, he gritted his teeth and persisted. After pushing the upper jaw several times in a row to no avail, he suddenly thought of a way. He immediately spread his hands, stuck them on both sides of the magic claw crocodile's body, and shook his whole body with all his strength. When his body shook, it quickly formed a kind of shaking range, causing the body of the magic claw crocodile to also shake slightly. In the continuous shaking, Dean suddenly felt the pressure on his body lighten a lot. He could not help but be happy, knowing that his idea was successful. This mountain of corpses was covered with blood, and the piled up together was not solid. If he shook, the corpses on top would slide down. As the pressure on top became lighter, Dean shook more and more. After 7 or 8 minutes, he tried to push the upper jaw of the magic claw crocodile again. With all his strength, he suddenly pushed it away. Dean was overjoyed and immediately drilled out of the pushed upper jaw. He saw that outside the body of the magic claw crocodile there was a pile of corpses of various monsters, and blood was flowing between the corpses. It was like a plate of exquisite gourmet food added with ketchup on the human dining table. Dean pushed away the corpses of other monsters and quickly climbed out of the pile of corpses. At the same time, he did not forget to tightly hold the first aid bag tied to the back of his clothes. Creeping on the edge of the pile of corpses, Dean quietly swept around and suddenly saw that it was a dark cave. The air was filled with a strange stench. The cave wall was extremely wide, about 10 meters high, and could accommodate Splitter crawling in. Rough slash marks could be seen everywhere on the wall, and the marks were huge. Even the Zamadeo made by humans could not make such long slash marks. Dean raised his hand and wiped the blood off his face. He sniffed his nose briefly, capturing the smell in the air. Soon, he found that the whole cave was filled with Splitter's smell. He could not rely on the smell to determine Splitter's hunting position at the moment. He realized that his sense of smell was flawed, so he immediately crept on the ground to listen. He did not hear any vibration. His heart was overjoyed, and he immediately ran out of the cave. After running for 7 or 8 steps, he suddenly thought of Black Scar. He could not help but look back at the mountain of corpses behind him. There were all kinds of corpses piled up on the mountain of corpses. He could not see the shadow of Black Scar. He secretly gritted his teeth and was about to turn around to leave. Suddenly, he saw something behind the mountain of corpses. His pupils slightly shrank. It was a huge white oval boulder. It was not so much a boulder, but a huge egg. Splitter's egg? Dean was startled on the spot, but soon recovered. He had no time to care about the egg, so he turned around and ran. He ran along the winding cave for more than 20 meters. After passing a corner, Dean looked up and suddenly froze. Chapter 291. He saw that the cave behind the corner was connected to the outside of the cave. However, there were a lot of boulders piled high at the exit. Only a glimmer of light shone from the outside. He was startled for a moment. Then, he quickly ran over and looked at the exposed area. However, he couldn't find a gap that he could squeeze his body through. Splitter had blocked the cave very tightly. It should be worried that other monsters would sneak in and eat its eggs while it was out hunting. Damn! Dean found a gap with a large exposed mouth and pushed the boulder with all his strength. Some gravel rolled down from the gap of the boulder, but the boulder remained motionless. Dean's face turned ugly. Suddenly, there was a slight tremor. Dean was surprised. He quickly jumped down from the boulder and crawled on the ground to listen. He heard a very high frequency of vibration. It was the same frequency as when Splitter left. It was back. Dean's pupils shrank. He quickly got up and ran back to the cave. He heard the sound of boulders rolling at the entrance. It was as if a mountain was being split open. He rushed to the front of the pile of corpses. He picked up a few scattered monster limbs and used them to cover his body. He lay down next to the pile of corpses and pretended to be dead. There was a gap between the broken limbs and the blood-stained hair. He squinted his eyes to observe the movement outside. At this time, the sound of boulders rolling had stopped, and the ground slightly trembled. Dean saw an extremely hideous and terrifying figure drilled into the cave from outside. Its whole body was covered with sharp scythes, like a super terrifying cutting machine. Every part of its body seemed to be a sharp weapon. It was simply a well-built super war machine. At this moment, the thing crawled to the side of the pile of corpses and stopped. He couldn't see the head or the eyes, but a part in the middle of its body suddenly rotated and split open, squeezing out a large number of corpses and blood. The blood fell in front of the pile of corpses that Dean was leaning against, piling up the corpses a little higher. Many of the scattered corpses rolled onto Dean's body, covering the gap he left to observe the movement, and were buried in the corpses again. After a moment, Dean felt the splitter leave again. This time it was covered with fewer corpses. His ears could clearly hear the movement outside. He immediately heard the sound of boulders piling up at the entrance of the cave. Dean's heart sank. At the same time, he was relieved. It was really creepy to be in the same cave as the splitter. He struggled to get out of the pile of corpses. He quietly touched the entrance of the cave. He saw the walls made of dense boulders. His heart was bitter, but he still held a glimmer of hope. He looked for a place where the glimmer was bigger. He was looking for a gap that he could squeeze out. However, the splitter's wall-building technique was quite high. It didn't leave such a lucky gap for him. Dean was disappointed and even desperate. He could only choose to push along the boulders to see which boulder was loose and could be pushed. If I had black weaver magic marks, I would be able to drill a hole and leave. Dean suddenly thought of other magic marks. Unfortunately, each person could only have one magic mark. Half an hour passed as he pushed and shoved the splitter. Then, the tremor sounded again. The splitter had returned. Dean was secretly surprised. The speed of the splitter's predation was too fast. It could return with a full load every time. It was simply a monster harvester. However, in this area, it was indeed a well-deserved overlord. No monster could compete with it. All of them were snacks that it could pick at any time. Dean immediately returned to the pile of corpses. He crawled back to the place where he had crawled out. He tried not to make too much changes to the pile of corpses so as not to attract the attention of the splitter. After all, there were very few records of this legendary monster in the atlas. There were only a few sketches of the front and the side of the monster, as well as some simple information and a rough prediction of the hunting level. He didn't know about its likes, intelligence, living habits, and so on. If it was a monster with high IQ, then Dean would be miserable. Moreover, from the current performance, even if the splitter wasn't a monster with high IQ, it would never be a monster with a strong physique but extremely stupid brain. Rumble. When he was lying on the pile of corpses, the boulder outside was once again broken open. A horrifying figure with a sickle twisted like seaweed poured into the cave. According to the previous method, from the middle of the body, which could barely be regarded as the back, it poured out the captured corpses. These corpses rolled down the mountain of corpses and slid down. A huge humanoid figure fell down. It was about 3 meters high. It was a variant large sickle zombie. There was a huge wound on the chest of the sickle zombie, but it was not a fatal wound. After falling down, it immediately threw itself on the pile of corpses and gnawed. Puff. After it gnawed a few times, a cold light flashed by. The sickle zombie's head froze and then slowly slid down from its neck. The blood in the wound was as thick as silk. After the head slid down, the black blood slowly gushed out like a hot spring, bathing the whole body. The head rolled down from the mountain of corpses and just fell next to Dean. It was still holding a piece of chewed flesh in its mouth. Its green eyes stared at Dean. When Dean saw the wound on its neck, his pupil slightly shrank. He immediately determined that the splitter's IQ was extraordinary. It actually knew that the fatal part of the sickle zombie was its neck. Moreover, it accurately killed the sickle zombie directly instead of tearing its body. After all the corpses were poured out, the splitter left again. Obviously, these corpses were not enough for it to survive the black snow season. After the splitter left, Dean, who was hiding under the boulder, was relieved. He felt that he had escaped a disaster. He immediately climbed out and saw that the entrance was blocked by dense boulders. There was still some hope in his heart. He went forward and looked around, hoping to find the missing gap. After all, the splitter was a monster. It was inevitable that there would be mistakes. How could it build so evenly and well every time? However, after a glance, Dean's idea was ruthlessly torn apart. The gap between the boulders was at most as thick as an arm. There was no place for him to squeeze out. He suddenly thought that these boulders were huge for him. But for Splitter, perhaps they were just small stones. Therefore, the splitter could easily use these small stones to seal the entrance of the cave. Dean was disappointed. He wanted to try to push the boulders piece by piece. Suddenly, he felt a sharp pain in his abdomen. He looked down and saw that it was from the previous wound. There was a trace of complexity in his heart. If he was not holding Scar, perhaps his body would have been pierced in 2 or 3 places. With the width of the scythe's tip, it was possible that the scythe would have pierced through his chest and heart. Fortunately, Splitter knew that it was a small prey. It didn't use too much force. It only used the tip of the scythe to pick up the scythe. As a result, the scythe had pierced deep into his chest. When it reached his chest, only the tip of the scythe was pierced. However, he couldn't even save Scar's body. After a moment of silence, Dean took out the first aid kit and went back to the pile of corpses. He took off his upper body armor and saw that there was blood near the wound. There was the smell of the blood of the monsters. Most likely, the blood of the monsters had penetrated through the wound. His face slightly changed. He clenched his teeth and applied disinfectant to the wound to wash the blood. He tore off a piece of gauze and wiped the wound. Then he used gauze to bandage it. In addition to the biggest wound in the abdomen, Dean also dealt with the wound on the shoulder and the scratches on the legs. Chapter 292. Splitter pushed away the boulders at the entrance of the cave and drilled into the cave. Dean quickly drilled into the pile of corpses. He hid under a few corpses and held his breath. The sound of Splitter's body rushing into the cave could be heard. His sharp blade scratched against the rock wall and stopped in front of the pile of corpses. Very quickly, a crashing sound could be heard and a large number of monster corpses were poured out. Dean felt that more and more corpses were rolling down and pressing on top of the corpses. He was secretly relieved. The more corpses he had, the higher the sense of security he had. Splitter didn't move again. The cave was silent. Dean's heart tightened as if a pair of terrifying and fierce eyes were staring at his hiding place. His heart was pounding as he held his breath. Time passed in silence for 2 or 3 minutes. Dean felt that he was out of breath. He didn't dare to continue to hold his breath as he didn't want to cause any movement. He boldly inhaled the air into his mouth to replace the carbon dioxide and oxygen in his lungs. He was extremely careful throughout the process. His whole body was tense and he didn't dare to make the slightest sound. There was dead silence in the cave. Dean felt that he could only hear the sound of his own heartbeat. It seemed that he had caused a great movement which made him more nervous. Time ticked by. Dean's tight muscles gradually became sore. He slowly relaxed but still carefully replaced his breath. In this silence, he even suspected that the splitter had left the cave. After a long time, Dean heard a slight friction sound. It was rough and harsh. He waited for a moment but didn't see any follow-up movement. He was a little relieved. He secretly smiled in his heart. Splitter should be tired from hunting, so it slept next to the pile of corpses. He didn't know how long this kind of monster's work and rest cycle was. If it slept for a few days, then he would be unlucky. In this long silence, Dudien's taut body could no longer hold on. Gradually, he felt sleepy. Although he knew that he wouldn't snore when he slept, but in this dangerous environment, it was difficult to fall asleep. However, fear could not overcome the desire to sleep. Dean had been fighting for a whole day when he encountered the splitter. First he had lured the magic claw crocodile, then he had killed the double-headed snake lizard. He had lured other monsters back and forth to help him consume his energy. Now his body was injured and he had lost a lot of blood. He was physically and mentally exhausted. He had persisted for more than an hour before he was swept away by sleepiness and fell asleep. In the darkness, countless rotting faces roared and reached out with pale white fingers. When he woke up again, it was with a start. Dean suddenly opened his eyes. In the dream, his body was trying to avoid the claws of the evil spirits. The moment he woke up, his body subconsciously trembled. As soon as he shook his consciousness, his pores shrank again. It was as if time had stopped for 2 or 3 seconds. He felt that there was no movement outside. The tightened pores slowly loosened. It seemed that Splitter was sleeping very well and wasn't disturbed. Dean was secretly glad. He adjusted his breathing and lay quietly in the pile of corpses. He felt the cold and hard corpses of the other monsters. He never thought that he would stay in such a purgatory for so long. Moreover, there was a horrible monster crawling next to him. No wonder hunters want to retire in the giant wall once they make money. They don't want to step out of the giant wall. Even if the area has been cleaned, it may not be safe. But it's relatively safe. Even if the risk factor is reduced to 10%, I will still die if I encounter danger once out of 10 times. Dean secretly sighed. He suddenly felt that he should stay in the Temple of Elements to make his own invention. The money he earned was far higher than the hunters. This time he had hunted a high-level monster like the double-headed snake lizard. The materials he got from its body were worth at most a few thousand gold coins. The only way to make money was to hunt some high-priced monsters. Of course, the most profitable way was to hunt the named monsters. But it was purely luck. Only a few hunters with extremely rich hunting experience had figured out a way to track the named monsters. They could increase the probability of hunting the named monsters. But in the process of tracking, they often had to venture into some dangerous areas or territories of other monsters. The most dangerous part of hunting outside the giant wall was not fighting with the monsters but wandering around. There was a trace of regret in Dean's heart. But he knew that God wouldn't give him a second chance to choose. Even if there was a second chance, he would still choose to come out of the giant wall. But he would be more cautious, think more carefully, and use more methods to avoid encountering monsters that wandered around and preyed on their prey. The areas that people divide are the areas in the eyes of humans. But in the eyes of the monsters, the entire outside the giant wall is a hunting area. Dean's heart was bitter as he secretly sighed. The silent and stiff waiting was long and boring. But there was an existence that could take away his life at any time. Dean didn't know how much time had passed. He felt a little hungry. At the same time, there were bursts of pain and itching from his wound. The paralysis toxin on the blade of the splitter had long lost its effectiveness. He slightly bit his teeth and resisted the urge to use his hand to grab the wound. After more than 10 hours, Dean felt a pain in his stomach. Fortunately, he was quite patient. He knew that if he continued to be hungry, his stomach would become numb and soon he wouldn't feel uncomfortable anymore. The fact was indeed as he thought. The hunger in his stomach quickly disappeared, but occasionally it would reappear. Dean knew that the splitter was still in the cave. If it went out to hunt while he was asleep, then it would have been back by now. So he didn't dare to act rashly. Time passed slowly as he endured. 2 days later, Dean felt that the splitter was still sleeping in the cave. It hadn't woken up yet. This made him a little flustered. Did it go into hibernation from now on? After 2 days of patience, he felt hungry. There seemed to be a strange feeling in the wound on his stomach. but he couldn't tell how strange it was. Dean was dizzy from hunger as he smelled the stench of the corpses around him. He twisted his head and stuck his face to the unknown monster's corpse. He gently bit off a small cluster of flesh and slowly chewed it. He tried not to make a sound and swallowed it. He couldn't feel any taste on his tongue. He only felt that it was very delicious. Even the fishy smell of the flesh was able to arouse his appetite. It was as if he had degenerated into a primitive barbarian. Kaka. Chapter 293. Dean, who was taking a light nap, woke up and listened attentively. Kacha. The crisp sound was getting louder and louder as it continued to echo intermittently. At the same time, a rough friction sound echoed in the silent cave. Dean's heart skipped a beat as he knew that it was the movement of Splitter. The previous cracking sound reminded him of the giant egg he saw behind the pile of corpses. Did it mean that the egg hatched? At this time, the cave slightly trembled, as if the Splitter was crawling, and the crisp cracking sound suddenly stopped. A moment later, a sharp crow-like voice sounded. The aura was weak, and it gave off a very immature feeling. Dean's heart sank. He knew that he didn't hear wrong. The Splitter's child was born. He felt a strong sense of danger. He shrank his body deeper into the cave. At this time, he heard the sound of chewing and swallowing. The sound came from the pile of corpses. Judging from the volume of the sound, it should be the newborn Splitter who was eating. He suddenly thought of a problem which made the last hope in his heart sink. Perhaps these captured monsters were not prepared by the Splitter for its own hibernation. With the Splitter's physique, it was completely unafraid of the cold and disasters of the black snow season. Moreover, most of the monsters would enter hibernation or hide in their nests during the black snow season. They rarely came out to move, but Splitter's ability could easily hunt for abundant food. It didn't need to hunt in advance in order to store food for itself to survive the black snow season. This was the difference between ordinary beasts and top monsters. The entire outside the giant wall was its hunting ground. All the monsters could be said to be its food reserves. And these captured monsters were obviously prepared for its child, the newborn legendary monster. Kacha, kacha. The sound of chewing and swallowing echoed in his ears. It seemed that it was quite hungry and thirsty. Dean's face was gloomy. He didn't know how long it would take for his turn. The newborn hunter continued to eat for more than 10 minutes before it stopped. Dean heard a light vibration coming from the ground. It seemed that Splitter was doing its post-meal activity. Suddenly, Dean felt that the corpses of the monsters that he was leaning against were hit. His body and the corpses of the monsters that were on top of him tilted a bit. The continuous impact sounds continued to appear. The strength was extremely strong. Each time the corpses of the monsters shook and loosened. Dean couldn't help but think of the monster atlas about Splitter, Splitter's infant stage. Hunting level 23. Its sawtooth blade could easily cut off the bodies of most monsters below level 30. It was extremely aggressive. It liked to hunt but didn't eat. Legendary monster. Dean's heart was bitter. The newborn Splitter should belong to the initial stage of infant stage. Even if it wasn't level 23, it was at least close to it. Moreover, the growth of Splitter was extremely fast. In just half a month, the body's bones and sharp blades would be completely stabilized. The hardness would be comparable to steel, and the sharp blades would be sharper than sword. In other words, after half a month, this newborn Splitter would already be a level 23 existence. Moreover, relying on the unique advantage of its body, it could even kill a level 30 monster if it was restrained by it. Moreover, the period between the infancy stage and the growth stage was only about 2 to 3 years. Once the growth stage was over, it would be fully matured. It would reach the peak of its combat power, hunting grade 68. It would sweep everything and stand at the peak of the monsters. This level evaluation was a rough prediction given by the inner wall. It wasn't absolutely accurate. It could be high or low, but the difference wouldn't be much. It didn't matter if it was 68 or 60, for Dean, both of them were existences that could easily kill him in seconds. The collision didn't last long before the newborn splitter stopped. It seemed that it was tired of eating. The sound of chewing sounded again, but it wasn't wolfing down the food like before. After it finished eating, it swayed around again. From time to time, the sound of rubbing against the wall could be heard. It seemed that it was using the rock wall to hone its sharp blade, making the blade sharper and smoother. Dean suddenly felt the difference between humans and beasts. Humans needed to learn and inherit knowledge from generation to play a role. Humans were destined to be social animals. Beasts were genetically inherited. Especially a terrifying monster like the splitter. It was born to be a hunter. Even if it was a wolf-like beast that liked to live in groups, it was born to bite. He silently lay in the monster's body. Perhaps it was because of the approaching death that he thought of many things that he didn't understand before. In a short moment it seemed that he had grown a lot. The rough sound of friction continued for a while, and then stopped. The cave fell into a brief silence. 7 or 8 hours later, the sound of the newborn splitter eating resounded once again. Gurgling sounds could be heard when it was chewing and swallowing. It was as if it was tasting a delicious and juicy meal, chewing until its mouth was full of fragrant juices. This time, the chewing sound was quite close to Dean, and as it continued to eat, the sound got closer and closer. Gradually, Dean could even feel the movement of other monsters being picked up through the corpses on his body. This made his heart tense up. His palm quietly touched the dagger beside his leg, ready to fight back. Even if he died, he would let the monster suffer a little. However, the sound of chewing stopped when it came to his side. It seemed that the little guy was full. It turned around and left. Dean was a little relieved in his heart, but there was no joy. Sooner or later, it would come. He tilted his head and gently bit the monster's corpse, chewing and swallowing the smelly flesh, trying his best to recover as much energy as possible. At this point, he did not care if there were viruses, radiation, or other toxins on these monsters' corpses. As long as he could recover some of his strength, he would be able to stab it a little deeper before he died. Even if he was directly poisoned to death, he would still be at ease. At this time, the sound of violent friction echoed. The ground slightly trembled. Dean heard the sharp voice of the newborn splitter. It seemed to be full of excitement. Dean listened to the movement and knew that it was the splitter. His heart quivered. Was the splitter going to hunt again? Thinking of this, his cold heart suddenly became a little excited. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was very possible. Previously, the splitter was sleeping in the cave not because it was tired, but because it had roughly estimated the time of its child's birth. So it slept in the cave and waited. Now that the child was born, it naturally wanted to go out and hunt. After all, the newly born splitter's food demand was huge. Relying on the previous food alone was not enough for this newborn splitter to strengthen its sharp blade. He guessed that the splitter rubbed the rock wall and left the cave. Its childish voice followed after it. Was it taking its child out to gain experience? Dean couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. If so, he might have a glimmer of hope to survive. As long as the cave wasn't blocked too much. Soon, the sharp voice stopped in the cave. At the same time, the sound of boulders rolling echoed. There was a trace of excitement in Dean's heart, but he immediately calmed down. He knew that he was thinking too much. However, this is a rare opportunity. At least God is merciful and gave me a fair chance to fight with its child. Although I will inevitably die in the end. There was a trace of self-mockery in the corner of Dean's mouth. Soon, the sound of boulders rolling calmed down. At the same time, there was a slight vibration outside. Gradually, it became inaudible. Chapter 294. In Dean's heart, this dark and silent cave had become the last hunting battlefield in his life. No matter the result, he would go all out. The sound of rough friction came from afar and slowly stopped in front of the pile of corpses. The sharp scythe cut the sand on the ground of the cave, making a soft sound. Soon, a slight tremor came from the pile of corpses, followed by the sound of chewing and swallowing, as well as the sound of bones cracking. It seemed that it had bitten a hard bone, and was stubbornly chewing and grinding it. It had learned to use the bones of its prey to hone its sharp teeth. Dean took a deep breath and very carefully turned his head. He looked out from a small gap in the corpses. He saw a miniaturized version of Splitter crawling in front of the pile of corpses and eating. Its seagrass body was like a praying mantis' scythe arms. It was using two of its scythe arms to pick up the corpses and stuff them into the organs that were protected by layers of hard armor. The hard armor was like the shell of a crab. It looked extremely hard. This should be its head. Dean quickly thought about many fighting scenes, how to get close to it, how to stab the dagger into its head, and then kill it. He quickly rehearsed in his mind. At this moment, Splitter, who was eating, suddenly stopped chewing. It slowly turned around and looked at the place where Dean was hiding. It seemed to be hesitating. After 2 seconds it slowly moved over. Its scythe arms were like a peacock spreading its tail. It made an attacking posture. Dean, who was hiding under the corpses, was surprised. He didn't expect Splitter to be so sensitive. He just took a glance and it was able to detect the difference. Suddenly he thought of another problem. Since the little Splitter was aware of his existence, then the adult Splitter must be aware of him. But it didn't kill him. Was it to be a whetstone for its child? Dean knew that some beasts would abandon their children in the early stages and let them experience in the jungle. Although this Splitter didn't do so, it didn't seem to have any intention of taking care of its child. This could be seen from the different types of monsters it had captured. For example, monsters like the demon claw crocodile. Even if it was dead, it was still extremely difficult to chew. The armor on its body was too hard. There were also other monsters, some of which were highly toxic, but still couldn't escape its hunt. Its purpose was probably to say, "I've found food for you. Whether you can eat it or not depends on your own ability." Dean realized that he survived not because of the goddess of luck, but because he was used as a moving food by Splitter so that his children could move their muscles and bones before eating. As these thoughts flashed through Dean's mind, the Splitter approached step by step. It used its long and slender scythe arm to cut the monster's corpse on Dean's body. The monster's body didn't move even after being pierced by the scythe. The Splitter seemed to be confused as it grew another scythe arm. It was thick and wide and the blade was serrated. It fiercely cut the monster's body back and forth. Thick black blood seeped out of the monster's body along with a faint smell of decay. Fortunately, the temperature in the cave was extremely low and it was humid and cool, so the decay of the monster's body wasn't serious. Soon the monster's body on Dean's body was almost sawed in half, but there was still no movement. The Splitter stopped and seemed to be looking at Dean in doubt. After a while, it stretched out two awl-like sharp organs and pierced into the demon's corpse. With a puff, it completely pierced through the body. Dean, who was under the monster's body, felt a sharp pain in his chest. The hunter's armor was easily pierced by a sharp object. Fortunately, the monster's body was thick and the Splitter's body was small, so it didn't penetrate deep. So it was only a minor injury. Dean clenched the dagger and gritted his teeth to endure. Splitter withdrew its sharp organs and looked at the corpse strangely. It lifted its scythe-like arm and swung it left and right. It wanted to turn the corpse over. But when its scythe-like arm was about to turn the corpse over, a silver light suddenly burst out from under the corpse. Splitter was surprised. He didn't expect that the dead thing that he had been attacking would suddenly come to life. He was caught off guard. He raised his scythe arm and swung it down at the same time. It was Dean's dagger that was full of killing intent as it hit the monster's body. The silver light bounced off the monster's body and fell to the ground next to the cave. It was Dean's dagger. The Splitter was startled. At the same time, Dean suddenly rushed out from under the corpse of the monster. He stepped on the shield formed by its scythe arms, turned over and climbed onto its back. His hands clung to the place where the monster had previously eaten. He was secretly glad that he had chosen to throw the dagger instead of holding the dagger for a sneak attack. Otherwise he would have been cut into pieces by the countless scythe arms. The splitter issued a panicked scream as Dean held the head of the splitter. It was mixed with anger. Dean didn't care about the injury on his left hand as he heard the scream. He roared and twisted the scythe arm with all his strength. In the face of this monster whose whole body was a sharp weapon, Dean did not know whether its scythe arm could twist 180 degrees to attack his back, but intuition told him that it could. Because of this, once it reacted, he would be cut into pieces in an instant. The strong fear and desire to win made him burst out with the greatest strength in his life, twisting his arm to this part. Gotcha! The scream of panic and anger was suddenly full of pain. It was extremely loud and harsh. Just as it reached the high part, it stopped abruptly. Puff! The sound of blood splashing rang out. Dean's body suddenly became light. His body was driven by a huge force and flew out. He fell down, rolled 7 or 8 times, and hit the wall of the cave behind him. His head hit the stone heavily. He was so dizzy that he almost fainted on the spot. He struggled to shake his head, his remaining consciousness telling him that he must not faint. Soon, his buzzing brain gradually stabilized, and his thoughts and consciousness became clear again. His first reaction was to look up, and he saw the monster with an extremely terrifying body structure. It was frozen in front of the pile of corpses, blood flowing from its front, and its body was motionless. Dean couldn't help but look down at his hand. It was a triangular armor. It was extremely hard and the inside of the joints was torn. Was it the head of the splitter? Did he forcibly break it off? Dean sat on the ground in a daze. It took him more than 10 seconds to recover. He saw that the new splitter lost its balance and slowly fell to the ground. It was completely motionless. Dean believed that the splitter was not pretending. It was really dead. He hugged its head and slowly got up to take a closer look. He saw that blood was continuously flowing out of its head, coating the dark ground with a layer of bright red paste. It's dead. Dean felt that his whole body was relaxed. He felt that it was incredible but also lucky. The whole process was completed in an instant. If it was a head-on battle then, he wouldn't be able to defeat the splitter with bare hands. The weakness of the body was a natural shortcoming of human beings. It was something that couldn't be changed. Fortunately, in order to make up for this point, God had given humans extremely intelligent brains. Recalling the moment of life and death, Dean felt a little scared, but his blood was boiling. After a moment, he gradually restored his calmness. He immediately ran to the entrance of the cave. He saw an impenetrable pile of boulders. He went forward and looked around carefully. He was extremely nervous as this was his only chance to survive. Gap, gap, Dean muttered in his heart. His eyes widened as he looked around. Chapter 295. Dean felt a trace of bitterness in his heart. He had to say that the sealing ability of Splitter was too good. No matter how many times it was done, there was never a mistake. Every time it was sealed tightly. It was estimated that even if it was a human, it would be difficult to maintain such seriousness and consistency. Dean felt like crying as his palms weakly drooped on the boulder. His hope was right in front of him. As long as he got out, he would have a chance to escape. However, he was blocked by these boulders. It was not easy to win the battle of life and death, but it was so close to leaving alive. Just a little bit more. Dean was unwilling, but he was powerless. He loosened his hand. His other hand was holding the heavy head of Splitter. He wanted to throw it away. Suddenly, a thought flashed through his mind. The Splitter was a monster bestowed its name by the legend. It had the Splitter's magic mark in its body. If he replaced its magic marks, could he break out of this boulder? Thinking of this, he immediately picked up the head of Splitter and touched the soft flesh inside the carapace to find the parasitic soul worm. At the same time, he quickly rushed back to the cave and searched in front of the body of Splitter, especially in the blood on the ground. Nothing in the head. Nothing in the body. Dean put the head next to the blood and bent down to search everywhere. He was extremely nervous. He knew that when the offspring of the named monster was born, the parasitic soul worm was still sleeping in its body, in the incubation state. Generally, when the monster was growing up, it would gradually wake up and be born. Then it would begin to absorb nutrients from the body of the named monster. At the same time, it would also absorb the characteristics of the genes. Then it would be digested into pieces of gene fragments and stored in its own body. Only then would it have the role of magic marks. And this newborn Splitter, from the time it hatched until now, it had only been 5 days. Its parasitic soul worm was probably still in its body. At this moment, with the death of the parasitic soul worm, it was also dead in the abdomen. With such worries, Dean carefully searched everywhere. The longer he searched, the slimmer the hope in his heart. After searching back and forth several times, he still could not find the shadow of the parasitic soul worm. The last glimmer of hope that Dean had just ignited was also extinguished. Gotcha! Just as he was disheartened and sitting in the blood, a clear voice suddenly rang out. It was extremely loud in this quiet cave. Dean could not help but be startled. He quickly got up and walked around the pile of corpses. Following the sound, his face was full of shock. Behind the pile of corpses, there were several huge skeletons. The skeletons were scattered, not whole. These skeletons surrounded a nest of weeds. Inside the nest were 6 snow-white oval giant eggs. At this moment, a cracking sound rang out from a giant egg at the edge. Meandering cracks appeared on its surface. Next to this huge egg was another broken eggshell. It should be the eggshell of the previous Splitter. Other than it, there were actually 6 more eggs here, and now another one was about to hatch. Dean was startled for a long time. Suddenly, he smiled bitterly. The vast majority of beasts were not the same as humans. They were pregnant for 9 months. Occasionally they would have twins and rarely triplets. For beasts, it was very normal to give birth to 7 or 8 babies at a time. Some fish could even give birth to hundreds or thousands of babies at a time, but the number that could survive was not many. The breeding habits of beasts were obviously transferred to the monsters. They were different from humans. When they were pregnant, it was the most dangerous time for them. They lacked food and safety the most. Therefore, if they gave birth one at a time, it would have a great impact on their life safety. Under the drive of the environment, it led to such evolution. They often gave birth to more babies at a time, which could reduce the number of times they faced danger and enhance their survival rate. Fight again. Dean silently looked at it and did not move. Although this was the best opportunity to sneak attack, he knew that even if he killed this little thing, it would not help. When the Splitter came back, it would be his doomsday. Previously, it used him as a whetstone for its child. Now that this whetstone had killed its child, it naturally would not let other children encounter such danger. However, if he did not fight, he could only wait for death. Dean sighed as he looked at the cracking giant egg. As the saying goes, 1 second is 1 second. The fewer the terrifying monsters, the safer it would be for the other hunters to go out to hunt. After all, he was the one who rented the giant wall passage. Old Foulin could hire other hunters to explore it after he died. If the Splitter grew up, then the passage would become a death passage. Dean picked up the dagger from the ground and quickly moved in front of the giant egg. Gotcha! The giant egg, which had already cracked open, suddenly cracked open completely. In the giant egg, there was a figure curled up into a ball, covered with viscous liquid, and smelled very fishy. It opened its eyes and curiously looked at the world outside the eggshell. When it saw Dean running next to the eggshell, the sharp scythe arms suddenly stretched out. Even though it was just born, the edge of the scythe was as sharp as metal, and with a bang, it completely opened the eggshell. Dean's face slightly changed. He didn't expect the newly hatched splitter to have such a posture. Compared to the previous one that he had killed, its body shape was exactly the same. The only difference was that the scythe-like arms and the carapace were lighter in color. He stopped moving. He knew that he had no chance of winning in a head-on battle. The newborn splitter rushed out of the eggshell and rushed towards Dean. Dean's face slightly changed as he retreated in a hurry. The newborn splitter stopped as it saw Dean retreat. Its dark green eyes blinked as it looked at Dean. Suddenly, it used its scythe to pick up a monster's corpse from the ground and handed it to Dean. Dean was vigilant as he retreated back. The new splitter stopped and blinked its eyes. It took back the monster's body and no longer looked at Dean. It lowered its head and stuffed the monster's body into its head. Its mouth and eyes weren't on the same organ. Dean was startled as he didn't expect it to not attack him. Did it think that he was not as delicious as these corpses? Or did it want to eat until it was full before dealing with him? In any case, this was a great opportunity. He quickly threw the dagger and rushed towards it. Whoosh! The dagger struck out, and the newborn splitter, who was eating, swung its scythe-like arms and knocked it down. Seeing Dean rushing over, it growled and raised its scythe arm to meet him head-on. What a fast reaction! Dean's face changed as he stopped in a hurry. The same trick had failed. The previous splitter didn't have time to react. Moreover, the distance between them was very close. It was difficult for the splitter to raise its scythe-like arms to block the dagger. But at the moment, the distance between them was too far, so it had enough time to react. Dean hurriedly ran around the mountain of monster's corpse as he saw it was still chasing him. The newborn splitter immediately stopped as it saw Dean run away. It lowered its head and continued to eat. Dean was relieved as he saw that the splitter ignored him. He quickly thought about other methods. The newborn splitter quickly ate thousands of pounds of meat. It stopped and shook its body as it waved its scythe-like arms. It seemed to be a little excited as it moved its scythe-like arms on the rock wall to hone its blade. It didn't catch Dean on the other side. It seemed that it had forgotten about Dean. Dean had long thought of a response plan. He didn't expect it to not attack him. He couldn't help but be surprised. What's going on? Dean was at a loss. It doesn't seem hostile to me. How could it be? Wait, is it? Chapter 296. Dean was in disbelief as he looked at the lively splitter. Was it because he was the first life that it saw after it was born that it regarded him as one of its kind? It was not scientific. There should be other reasons. But this reason alone is too unreasonable. Dean's face changed. His reason told him that it was not so simple. Otherwise, why would it be so troublesome for humans to tame wild beasts? Wouldn't it be easy to tame it as long as he was the first one to show up when the cubs were born? Not to mention a monster that was 100 times more ferocious than a beast. Suddenly, Dean thought of something. He looked down at his body and saw that the hunter's armor was full of blood. It was the blood of the parasitic soul worm that he had found in Splitter's body. He suddenly understood that perhaps the smell of the blood made Splitter regard him as one of its kind or a brother. It was not nonsense like mother or something like that. For the time being, it has mistaken me as one of its kind. After a long time, it will naturally be able to distinguish me. Moreover, I should be dead by then. Dean looked at Splitter, who was dancing. His eyes flashed. He wanted to sneak close to it and kill it. He took 2 or 3 steps forward. He looked at Splitter, who was still rubbing its sharp blade against the rock wall. Suddenly, he thought of an idea. His eyes lit up as he thought of this idea. His blood boiled up. Once again, he felt the hope of life. Come. Dean picked up the dagger that was previously knocked to the ground. He came to a few meters behind Splitter and tried to call it. Although he knew that Splitter may not be able to understand his language. When Splitter heard Dean's call, it turned around and looked at him with its emerald eyes. It seemed to be at a loss. Dean had no experience in taming beasts, but he had seen people tame puppies. He imitated their appearance and waved to it. "Come here, hiss, come here." Dean waved and moved back. Splitter looked at him for a moment and slowly moved its body towards Dean. He controlled the rhythm of his retreat and slowly guided the great Splitter to the entrance of the cave. 10 minutes had passed since the great Splitter went out to hunt. The last time the great Splitter went out to hunt was 30 minutes later. In other words, he had at most 20 minutes left. However, it was also possible that he would be back in a few minutes. In these 20 minutes, the great Splitter could appear at any time, and that would be the time of his death. Dean took a deep breath as he looked at the new Splitter who was standing at the entrance of the cave. He pointed at a hole and tentatively said, "Smash it, smash it." He patted the rock wall. Splitter tilted his head and looked at him, not moving an inch. Dean was very nervous. Seeing that it did not respond, he could not help but feel anxious. But he knew that this matter could not be rushed. He could only guide it slowly. He endured the anxiety and repeatedly said, "Follow me, smash, smash it." Then he hammered his hand on the rock. Splitter quietly looked at him and didn't respond. Dean's voice was a bit louder. "Follow me, smash it hard." Both of his hands continued to hit the rock. At the same time he looked at Splitter. Perhaps the sorrowful expectation in his eyes had an effect. The newborn Splitter looked at him for a while, then slowly raised its scythe-like arms and chopped at the rock wall. Rustling sounds came out, and the friction made an ear-piercing sound. Dean was relieved as he saw this. He felt that his whole body was soaked in sweat. "Use all your strength." Splitter stopped as it saw him stop. Dean was stunned for a moment. He immediately continued to slap the rock with his hands. Splitter lifted its scythe-like arms and cut the rock. Puff, puff. Scratches appeared on the boulder as the scythe arms cut through it. Dean saw that there was a complete boulder in front of it. With its new scythe arm, it might not be able to cut it even after a day. There was a small gap that could accommodate its arm, which happened to be half a meter away from it. Dean wanted to lift it up and move it to the small gap to let it cut it, but he knew that it might not let him get close to it. Even if he held it, he would not be able to lift it. "Come on, follow me. Take 3 steps." Dean continued to lead by example. He moved to the left while smashing the boulder. Splitter ignored him as it continued to cut the boulder in front of it. Dean quickly increased his voice. He succeeded in getting the attention of Splitter. He repeatedly moved back and forth. A few minutes later, the newborn Splitter also moved his body and stood in front of the gap. Dean was excited beyond words. He couldn't wait to give himself a few warm applause. He immediately said, "Come on, use your maximum strength." He used all his strength to punch the boulder. Of course, he wouldn't use his full strength. If his fist collided with the boulder, it would be his fist that would break. Under Dean's demonstration, Splitter's chopping speed became faster and faster. Its scythe arm cut off a large number of stones. Dean was excited. It was a legendary monster. Its learning ability was terrifying. It was even more terrifying than humans. Newborn human babies wouldn't be like this. "Quick, quick, quick," Dean shouted as he pretended to beat the boulder. Although he knew that Splitter couldn't understand his words. Bang, bang. Splitter's scythe-like arms cut the boulder. Many small stones were cut off. The previous gap became bigger. Dean saw that the gap was almost big enough. He quickly stopped and said, "Stop, stop." Splitter heard the sound and noticed Dean. He also stopped when he saw Dean stop. Dean saw that Splitter was blocking the gap. He quickly ran back into the cave and said, "Come here, come here." Splitter retracted its eyes as it saw him run away. It continued its previous practice. Dean was annoyed as he saw that Splitter didn't follow him. He picked up a monster's claw from the ground and threw it towards Splitter's back. Bang! Splitter, who was in the middle of training, suddenly raised his scythe-like arms. With a furious look on his face, he turned around and charged into the cave. Dean waited for Splitter to enter the cave. He immediately circled around the pile of corpses. Along the way, he kept throwing the corpses towards Splitter in an attempt to divert its attention. This method really disturbed Splitter. The distance between the two was pulled apart. Dean saw that the time was almost right. He quickly bypassed the pile of corpses and ran towards the entrance of the cave. He drilled into the big gap. In order to pass through in one go, he had taken off his hunter's armor. Some parts of the armor were too hard. For example, the shoulder waistcoat. Moreover, it was thick and took up space. Dean was bare-chested, wearing only a pair of shorts, and drilled into the gap. The gap was too narrow. His head easily drilled into the gap. However, his head was stuck for a few inches when it reached the shoulder. Dean gritted his teeth. He knew that he couldn't retreat here. If he stayed, he would die. He rubbed his skin and flesh and drilled into the gap. He felt a burning pain on his right shoulder. His shoulder rubbed against the rough stone. It should be bleeding. Dean wriggled and rushed into the gap. He was like a worm. Once his shoulder drilled into the gap, it was much easier for him to crawl into the gap. Dean grabbed the stone below. Inch by inch, he crawled forward. It was like he was crawling from the bloody hell to the human world. The small gap in front of him was his hope to survive. His shoulder was squeezed on various rough stones. When he was halfway through the gap, he felt a sharp pain in his shoulder. He bumped into a sharp stone. Dean clenched his teeth in pain, growled, and rushed forward. He felt a tearing pain coming from his shoulder, almost making him faint, just like when he was pierced by a steel nail. Dean clenched his teeth, growled and crawled at full speed. Whoosh! His palm grabbed the stone outside. Dean used all his strength to squeeze his body out and fell to the ground. Hiss! There was a faint cry from behind the gap. It seemed to be very anxious. It was from the newborn Splitter. Dean didn't have the mind to care about it. He saw that the Splitter hadn't come back yet. He glanced around and looked at the sky. He instantly identified the direction from the position of the sun and ran to the right. Bang! Bang! Chapter 297. Run! 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 Dean wanted to put a pair of wings on himself. At the moment his body exuded the smell of Splitter. If he was smelled by the big Splitter, it would certainly track him down. So the only way to save his life was to run out of its perception range as soon as possible. I was caught by it before. I don't know where I am now. Dean's face was ugly. The only thing that made him feel a little lucky was that there was Splitter living here. Moreover, it was a child that was praying for its child. It meant that he wouldn't encounter other monsters within a long distance. However, it also meant that he would be in extreme danger once he encountered it. Monsters that could hide from Splitter must have special hiding method. It was extremely difficult to deal with. After a few minutes Dean had run more than 10 miles away. Weeds were growing all along the way which greatly affected his speed. There is a ruined city on the way, but it has been completely occupied by plants. There are no significant landmarks on the terrain. Dean took out the map and looked at it. Although he had taken off the hunter's armor, he didn't abandon the map hidden inside the armor. This was the key to finding the giant wall quickly. Otherwise, even if the Splitter didn't catch up with him, he would get lost in the vast ruins and stray into the food of other monsters. Scanning the map, Dean firmly remembered it and continued to run forward, looking for landmark. Suddenly, the rustling sound of the grass echoed. It was like the sound of strong wind cutting the grass root. Dean's face slightly changed. He looked back and was startled. He saw a terrifying seaweed-like figure was chasing after him. It was running like a spider and cutting off all the weeds on both sides of its body. It was the Splitter. However, it wasn't the big one but the newborn Splitter. It was said to be small but its size was the height of an elephant. Damn! Dean's face turned ugly. He didn't say anything as he turned around and ran away. There was an impulse to curse out loud in his heart. How could the little thing break through the huge pile of rocks? How could it come out? Most importantly, it was chasing after him relentlessly. There was no doubt that if the great splitter returned to its nest and saw its dead child, and the missing one, it would follow the smell and chase after them. But if the little guy stayed in the cave and the other child died, then it would stay in the cave to guard them. The possibility of it chasing after them would be reduced by a lot. But now, there was a 99% chance that they would track him. After all, even the demon-clawed crocodiles hidden in the basin swamp were found and hunted by it. At that time, even his nose could not detect the hidden demon-clawed crocodiles. It could be seen that its hunting ability was absolutely terrifying. Dudian ran all the way to get rid of the little devil. The sound behind him didn't get far. The speed of the newborn splitter was extremely fast. As time passed, its speed was getting faster and faster. It seemed that it was gradually adapting to the coordination of its body. Dudian looked back at the chasing appearance of the great splitter. He secretly complained in his heart. He might not be able to kill the great splitter if he fought it head-on. Previously, he was able to deal with the great splitter by sneak attack and surprise attack. Now it was difficult to arrange the same environment and it would take time. Once the great splitter returned to the cave, it would immediately chase after him. The latter's terrifying speed wasn't something he could compare with. Dudian panted as he ran. After all, the human's physical strength was limited. His speed was getting slower and slower. Soon the new splitter caught up with him. Dudian simply stopped and held the dagger. He turned his head and stared at the great splitter. The new splitter quickly reduced its speed as it saw Dean stop. It stopped a few meters away from Dean and hissed. It seemed that its vocal cords hadn't developed yet, as it couldn't roar and shout out its real voice. Dean bared his teeth at it and waved his dagger in a menacing manner. The new splitter blinked from time to time. It didn't seem to be out of breath. Dean slowly and tentatively stepped back. The new splitter slowly moved forward. Dudian accelerated to retreat. The new splitter accelerated forward. Dudian immediately stopped. The new splitter also stopped. Dean had a feeling of collapse when he saw this. He wanted to pick up a stone and smash it away, but then he thought that such an action might have the opposite effect. It would irritate it and rush over to communicate with him, and then he would be sliced. He couldn't help but feel a little aggrieved. Just a newborn little guy had such terrifying lethality. It was simply unreasonable. I thought that there would be rich second generation among humans. I didn't expect that there would be second-generation monsters. Dudian's mouth was bitter. Suddenly he thought of a way. Since he couldn't run or beat it, the only way to get rid of it was to trap it. Dudian looked at the map. He was vigilant as he was afraid that the splitter would suddenly pounce on him. He had observed two relatively recognizable terrains along the way. One was a big lake and the other was a mountain. Although it was just a glance, but he still remembered the shape of the lake and the rules of the edge. Although there were many big lakes outside the giant wall, but the big lake near the Death Passage and the similar shape of the lake were likely to be able to roughly infer his position. Especially there was a mountain next to the lake. There were several big lakes in the vicinity of the Death Passage. Dudian stared at them for a few times. Suddenly he saw a lake with a similar shape. There was also the shape of a mountain next to it. His eyes lit up. When he saw the area he was in, he immediately confirmed that this was where he was. This was because this area was the territory occupied by the Scott Financial Group, which was one of the 3 areas outside of the Death Passage. The word 0 indicated that this was the Scott Financial Group's Area 0. Moving horizontally along the parallel lines of this region was the 3rd region outside the Death Tunnel. Finally found the position. Dean was overjoyed. He quickly chose a route, turned around and ran. The new splitter saw Dean turn around and run away. It immediately chased after him. Dudian's eyes were gloomy. He secretly prayed that the splitter wouldn't catch up so soon. But the feeling of death coming at any time made his muscles tense. He didn't dare to relax. Whoosh! Dudian ran through the wilderness along a relatively safe route. After 2 or 3 minutes, Dean suddenly found that the new splitter didn't have any malice towards him. When he slowed down due to physical exhaustion, the splitter's speed would also slow down accordingly. It didn't directly catch up to attack. Chapter 298. Whoosh! In the grass, Dean, who was running at a high speed, kicked a hard object. His body staggered and almost fell. He quickly crawled forward with his hands on the ground. At the same time, he heard a low roar from behind. He could not help but look back. He saw a monster that looked like a tortoise but had a very long tail. The monster's scales were as rough as rock. It seemed that it had been napping in the grass but was awakened at the moment. It shook its body and turned its head to look at Dudian. Then it quickly turned its head to look at Splitter, who was chasing from the other side. The newborn Splitter noticed it, and its emerald eyes suddenly revealed a bloodthirsty killing intent. Its ferocious eyes slightly narrowed, and it stopped in front of the tortoise-like monster, confronting each other. Dean was happy as he saw it. He immediately turned around and ran away. He recognized this monster. It was called a stone tortoise. An adult stone tortoise could hunt for monsters up to level 22, and its defense was extremely strong. Even the arrows of a high-ranked hunter would not be able to leave a mark on its shell. If one wanted to kill it, they would have to use other hunting methods, such as burning it with fire or anesthesia. After running for hundreds of meters, Dean faintly heard roars coming from behind. He knew that the two were fighting. However, with the strength of the stone turtle, there was almost no hope of winning. But relying on its hard defense, it could buy him some time. This little guy is tracking me by relying on my smell. If I use the blood of other monsters or mud to eliminate the smell, maybe I can get rid of it. Dean's eyes flashed. The appearance of the stone turtle made his mind quicken, and he immediately thought of some ways to escape. Soon, he saw a puddle of water. He carefully checked the surroundings, and after confirming that there were no monsters hiding, he immediately dug up the mud in the puddle and smeared it on his body. Dean heard the rustling of the grass when he was halfway through. He looked back and saw a black spot rushing towards him. It was the new splitter. So fast. Dean's pupils shrank. He was a little surprised. The battle ended in less than half a minute? Dean's face changed as he saw the blood on the scythe arms of the newborn splitter. He didn't continue to smear the mud. If he completely covered the blood on his body, then he wouldn't be able to escape the fate of being hunted by the splitter. He immediately got up and ran. He recalled the map in his mind as he ran. It didn't take long for Dean to run along the diagonal line of the map towards the second area of the death tunnel. He silently calculated the time in his mind. 30 minutes had passed. The large splitter was probably on the way to catch up with him. With the other party's terrifying speed, it could catch up with him in 5 minutes. In other words, he had 5 minutes to live. The time is too short. It will take at least 15 minutes to run to the entrance of the giant wall. Dean's face was ugly. Suddenly he thought of the quagmire where the demonic claw crocodile was lurking. He immediately ran towards the quagmire. 2 minutes later, Dean came to the swamp basin. When he saw the scene in the basin, Dean was shocked. He saw that the swamp basin, which was previously covered with dark green aquatic plants, was now a mess. There were 7 or 8 huge scratches, which were several feet wide, in the basin swamp. The muddy water inside was scattered with blood. Even half of the claw of the magic claw fell in one place, and the cut was extremely neat. Dean couldn't help but think of the previous demonic claw crocodiles that were caught by the great splitter. Apparently, they were caught from here. He used fire to force out more than 10 demonic claw crocodiles. But in the end, only 3 of them came out. The rest were afraid of the double-headed snake lizard lurking on the shore, so they retreated back into the swamp. He didn't expect that they would be swept away by the great splitter. Dean quickly recovered. He looked around and found some vines from the weed. He pulled them up and tore them off. He ran to the other side of a collapsed boulder. He wrapped the vines around it and held the other side. He ran around the basin swamp until he reached the opposite side of the boulder. At this time, the new splitter also caught up. It saw Dean and suddenly hissed and rushed over. There was a trace of a low growl in its voice. Dean saw the splitter and waited for it to catch up to about 5 meters. He quickly pulled the vines and rushed into the basin swamp. After 7 or 8 steps, the soles of Dean's feet were suddenly covered with mud, and his speed was sharply reduced. With every step he took, he sank a few inches into the swamp. As he lifted his foot, his other foot also sank deeper. He flipped back and forth. When he took 16 or 17 steps, he could no longer run fast. His feet had sunk to his knees. He quickly grabbed the vines, and with one hand in the shape of a palm, he crawled in the quagmire, struggling to move forward. A low cry with a trace of fear came from behind. Dean looked back and saw that the new splitter had caught up with him. Its body had also sunk into the basin swamp. Its huge body and sharp scythe arms caused it to sink faster than him. Dean breathed a sigh of relief and quickly climbed forward. With the help of the vines, he quickly climbed straight through the basin swamp and came to the dry shore on the other side of the swamp. He turned over and climbed out of the swamp. He shook off the mud on his body. Suddenly he heard a cry from behind. The cry was full of panic. He couldn't help but look back. He saw that the newborn splitter had climbed to the position of 15 or 16 steps away from the swamp. Most of its body was submerged. The scythe blades on its body were stirring quickly, but it was sinking faster. At the moment it was making a cry. It was full of panic and seemed to be asking for help. Dean's face slightly changed. He quickly retracted his eyes and ran at full speed. His heart was full of urgency as he ran along the nearest straight line. 2 minutes later, Dean was close to the edge of the first area. He didn't encounter any monsters along the way. Perhaps they were scared away by the previous great splitter. Or maybe they were scared away by his fire. Suddenly, a buzzing sound came from behind. Dean's heart jumped. He couldn't help but look back. He was stunned. He saw a figure chasing after him. It was the new splitter. It climbed out? How was it possible? Dean was shocked. Soon, he noticed that behind its scythe arm, there seemed to be transparent wings vibrating, making a buzzing sound. Although its body was sprinting on the land, its speed was faster than before, as if there was something on its body and it could fly at any time. It had wings. Flying monster? Dean was scared and rushed forward at full speed. The newborn splitter caught up with Dean and walked side by side with him. It hissed as if it was greeting him under the protection of the scythe and the armor. Dean was relieved to see that it didn't have any intention to attack him. He ran all the way. At the same time, he was vigilant in case it suddenly pounced on him. After all, the behavior of monsters was unpredictable. The thin transparent wings on the back of the new splitter's scythe arms were vibrating rapidly like the wings of an insect. The mud on the surface of the scythe had already been shaken off by the vibrations. The speed of the splitter easily surpassed Dean as it ran in front of him. However, it quickly circled around Dean and ran in front of him at a fast speed. Dean had a headache. He was angry but didn't dare to speak. He wanted to kick it away. After running for 7 or 8 minutes, Dean finally arrived in front of the giant wall. He was relieved. He didn't expect that the great splitter hadn't caught up yet. It was even later than he had predicted. Perhaps it was because it returned to the cave later than before. It didn't take 30 minutes but 40 minutes or even longer. However, Dean didn't dare to stay here. He didn't want to be killed at the door. He quickly lifted the floor and drilled into the hole. The new splitter saw this scene and quickly chased after him. It seemed quite anxious. Dean didn't dare to let it in. He quickly pulled down the iron plate and locked it. Bang! Bang! The heavy iron plate was put down. Violent knocking sounds echoed from above. Dean's face turned ugly. He was about to turn around and leave the passage. But he suddenly thought that if the Great Splitter caught up and saw the little guy, it would be aware of the abnormality inside the iron plate. Once it attacked, the iron plate would be cut off. As a result, the secret passage would be exposed in front of them. If the Great Splitter drilled into the giant wall from here, the entire outer wall will become its dining table. Dean's eyes flashed. Although other people's life and death have nothing to do with me, but there is likely to be a way to deal with this monster in the inner wall. If they capture the Great Splitter, then the benefits won't come to me. He hesitated as he thought of this. If other people knew Dean's thoughts at the moment, then they would vomit blood. He had just resolved the crisis, but now he wanted to kill the Great Splitter in the future. It was simply reckless. Dean thought for a moment. I have to take the risk. Now that he was in the passage, his life guarantee had greatly improved. The first thing that came to his mind was to find a way to kill the Great Splitter. After all, it was a legendary monster. The difficulty of finding it was 10 times, or even dozens of times higher than killing it. Such a rare monster was hard to encounter in decades. If it broke into the giant wall, then it was bound to be besieged and hunted down. After all, no matter how strong it was fighting alone. Moreover, Dean believed that since the inner wall was able to evaluate such a monster, it meant that they had captured it before. Or perhaps scouts had secretly observed it. Even if there was no way to suppress it, then they could rely on human tactics to kill it. Dean didn't believe that the entire giant wall of Sylvia would be destroyed by a single monster. If so, then it wouldn't be able to survive for 300 years. Chapter 299. Dudian clenched his teeth as he heard the sound of the impact. He lifted the iron plate with both hands and opened a gap. Just as a crack appeared on the iron plate, several sharp sickle blades suddenly pierced through, and the iron plate was immediately pried open, revealing the ferocious appearance of the newborn Splitter. Seeing that the iron plate was finally open, it seemed a little excited and immediately drilled down. Dean quickly retreated and looked at it vigilantly. The newborn Splitter drilled into the passage. Dean slowly retreated. The newborn Splitter looked at it as it slowly moved forward. Dean came to the other end of the passage in front of the iron plate. He took off the iron lock that was not retracted. He slowly pushed the iron plate to a gap, revealing a glimmer of light to shine in. Dean looked back and saw the new Splitter coming towards him. Its sharp scythe could cut him in half in an instant. He took a deep breath and pushed the iron plate away. He quickly climbed out. There were 2 Knights of Light standing outside the passage. The 2 Knights of Light had noticed the movement of the iron plate. They looked back and were stunned to see Dean's naked upper body rushing out. The next moment they saw the terrifying figure that followed Dean. Their pupils dilated and their faces turned pale. They were stunned on the spot. Dean climbed out of the iron plate and quickly went to the back side of the iron plate. He saw the newborn Splitter rushing out of the passage. It was attracted by the 2 Knights of Light. It screamed excitedly and rushed towards them. Dean immediately slipped back into the passage. He ran to the other end of the wall and pulled down the iron plate. He thought that the smell of the newborn Splitter might remain in the vicinity. He pulled out the weeds near the iron plate and dug out some mud. He crushed the weeds so that the juice would diffuse the smell and interfere with the residual smell in the air. Although he didn't know what the effect would be, but a little bit was a good thing. Dean returned to the passage and locked the iron plate. He stepped out of the passage and saw that the newborn Splitter had killed the 2 Knights of Light. It was holding their bodies and gnawing them. One of the Knights of Light's upper body had been eaten and blood was splashing all over the place. Dean found that there was no pity in his heart as he saw the same kind die in front of him. He was like an indifferent stone. Whoosh! He got up and climbed out of the passage. He closed the iron plate and came to the front of the newborn Splitter. He waved to it to follow him. The newborn splitter looked up when it heard Dean's voice. It lowered its head and continued to gnaw the Night of Light in its hand. Soon the Night of Light was completely eaten. Its claws hooked another Night of Light that had a few holes in it. It stuffed the Night of Light's head under its body. It chewed and swallowed the Night of Light's head. Dean's eyes twitched. He didn't want to stay here any longer, so he quickly ran away. After running for dozens of meters, Dean heard the sound from behind. It was the footsteps of the newborn splitter. Now he didn't need to look at the footsteps to recognize it. Dean was relieved to see that his charm was still there. He looked back and saw that the scythe arms were full of blood. It exuded the smell of human blood. The upper body of the Night of Light was bitten off. It seemed that it wasn't because of his charm but mostly because it was full. There are Knights of Light sent by the Holy Church to guard outside the giant wall all year round. Once other monsters sneak into the giant wall, they will be aware of it. Now this little guy is here. If the Holy Church kills it, then it will be too easy for them. I have to find a way to hide it. But where can I hide it? Its mother is outside and the Holy Church is patrolling inside. Dean was thinking as he ran. Although it was a cub, it was a legendary monster after all. After a few years of cultivation, he could hunt it and take its magic mark. The value of a legendary magic mark was estimated to be not inferior to a legendary item. Moreover, it was also priceless, and it all depended on luck. The Holy Church is stationed in the vicinity of the giant wall. The only hiding place is the radiation area. There are barbarians and radiation monsters living there. Hiding it there won't arouse any attention. Even if it is exposed, it will have nothing to do with me. Dean's eyes flashed, but the difficulty is how to sneak into the radiation area from the Holy Church's line of defense. He looked at the dry desert around him and sniffed the scents in the air. His eyes became serious and focused. In the perception ability, the transmission of smell was the slowest. It was not as good as vision. It was not as good as hearing. It was the transmission of sound. But the sense of smell was the furthest perception. As the smell drifted, it continued to volatilize. It could sense things within dozens of miles. Moreover, it could trace the source of the smell and find the object that emitted the smell. Although the smell would be blown away by the wind, the smell was sticky. This was the reason why the hounds could rely on the smell to track the escaped prisoners. Dean smelled the mottled odors floating in the desert. If it was an ordinary person, he would not be able to smell anything. But Dean's olfactory cells could distinguish millions of different smells. He had a high analytical ability. He could find the smell he wanted from many mixed smells. He was like a human hound, but his nose was more sensitive than most of the hounds. Soon, Dean smelled the smell of the previous Nights of Light. There were several directions. He followed the smell in front of him. After a moment, Dean saw a fortress with the flag of the Holy Church on it. Dean turned around and ran parallel to the fortress. He wanted to see the distance between the fortresses. It would be the easiest to sneak through the fortresses. Moreover, he had to be fast. If the Knights of Light had the ability to smell, then sooner or later they would be detected by the Knights of Light. However, just as he turned around, a figure suddenly rushed out from behind him. Dean was stunned as he looked back. He saw that the new splitter had rushed out towards the fortress. Damn! Dean's face changed. He wanted to catch up and stop the splitter, but he decisively gave up as he saw the speed of the splitter. He turned around and found a cover. The people in the fortress are dead. The Holy Church will definitely send people to check. They will find out that it was the work of the monsters. They will go all out to search. While searching, they will definitely send Knights of Light with perception ability over. At present, the best detection and tracking ability is the sense of smell, as well as things like homologous insects. At that time, they will even find me. His expression changed for a while, and he immediately thought of something. He had the ability of smell, so he knew how to cover up his scent and how to prevent scent tracking. His only worry was that the other party would use other unknown methods to track him, and that would be impossible to guard against. While he was thinking, the newborn splitter had already rushed to the front of the stronghold of the Radiant Church. The Knights of Light on duty on the stronghold immediately saw this terrifying figure enter the range of their binoculars. Immediately, the Knights of Light rang the bell. The speed of the newborn splitter was extremely fast. When the bell rang above the stronghold, it had already rushed to the front of the stronghold. Attracted by the loud and clear bell, it immediately pounced on the Radiant Knight who pulled the bell. Its scythe-like arms danced and instantly cut the Radiant Knight into several pieces. The new splitter started to chew after killing the Knight of Light. Obviously the chase had consumed a lot of physical energy. It was very hungry. Bastard! A loud roar suddenly rang out. Chapter 300. When the newborn splitter heard the shout, he turned around with the half-eaten Knight of Light in his arms. He saw the silver-armored middle-aged knight rushing towards him with a spear in his hand. The spear was half the length of a standard cavalry spear. The tip of the spear was flickering with a cold light. It was trembling and swaying, making it difficult to predict the specific direction of the attack, making it impossible to parry. However, the newborn splitter was not human. Every part of its body was covered with sharp blades. The moment the knight's spear was about to pierce it, it immediately abandoned the half of the light knight's body and quickly crawled out like a spider. Its scythe-like arms came from all directions. Ding ding! The knight's spear was immediately cut off by the scythe-like arms. Because the spear needed flexibility, the spear was not made of metal. What? The middle-aged knight was shocked. He turned around in horror, but it was too late. The newborn splitter caught up with him at an even faster speed. It casually waved its scythe-like arms and easily pierced through the middle-aged knight's body. One of the scythe-like arms swept past the middle-aged knight's upper body and immediately cut off his head from the ear. The remaining half of the head was cut smooth, and the brain was flowing out of the wound. The middle-aged knight died on the spot. Commander! Monster! When the group of light knights saw the tragic death of the middle-aged knight, their complexion greatly changed. They were aghast when they saw the ferocious and terrifying monster. Their previous courage disappeared in an instant. The newborn splitter was about to bite the middle-aged knight, but when it saw the group of light knights, it let out 2 low growls. The growl was somewhat deep, and it was no longer like the previous hissing sound. Its body slightly moved and suddenly bounced out like a hedgehog. It fell into the group of light knights. In a flash, 2 light knights were cut off. Their eyes were wide open in horror as they fell to the ground. When the light knights saw such a terrifying scene, their complexion turned pale. Their whole body trembled as they frantically turned around and ran away. The newborn splitter was as fast as lightning. It caught up with them like a phantom. Before they could see its movements clearly, they saw the Knights of Light who were caught up with it had already been cut into several pieces. One of the handsome blonde Knights of Light was running away in panic. His helmet fell to the ground, and his snow-white face was filled with fear. A sharp sickle arm pierced through his spine and came out from his chest. It pierced through his body and lifted him up high in the air. "Ah!" The golden-haired knight screamed in pain. The other scythe-like arms of the newborn splitter streaked across the air, as if it had been startled. The body of the newborn splitter was cut into several pieces, and fell to the ground. The miserable shriek also stopped abruptly. In less than a minute, the stronghold had turned into a purgatory. Dean saw this scene from afar, but he was relieved. He pulled out the grass with small thorns on the ground, twisted it into a rope, and wrapped it around his feet. He ran to the other side of the barrier so as not to leave his footprints on the ground. He wanted to disguise this attack as a monster attack, and it had nothing to do with humans. Even if the little guy was found by the Holy Church, he would not be implicated. What's more, the truth was that he hadn't done anything at all. Soon, Dean went around to the other side of the stronghold and entered the radiation zone. Because it was close to the stronghold, there was no smell of blood in the air. Radiation mutant beasts rarely wandered around here. After entering the radiation zone, Dean turned around and looked at the barrier, waiting quietly. After a moment, as he expected, the newborn splitter jumped down from the barrier and chased after him. What a terrifying little guy! Dean looked at its bloody scythe arms. Dean's heart was filled with emotion. The Knight of Light who was guarding the stronghold had the physique of a senior hunter. Although he lacked combat experience, fighting skills, and experience in dealing with monsters, but his physique was still there. He didn't have the leeway to resist and was killed by the little guy. It must be known that the little guy was born less than an hour ago. Dean turned and ran away as he saw the little guy coming closer. The Light Vatican will definitely pay close attention to a stronghold that was wiped out. They can guess from the scene that the stronghold was attacked by an extremely powerful monster. In that case, they will definitely find someone with perceptive abilities to track the scent. However, the radiation zone is now the world of the savages. The Light Vatican probably won't go so far as to risk entering the radiation zone just to hunt a monster. Unless they send an elite team of senior hunters, then they will need to cooperate with the 6 consortiums. The Knights of Light of the Holy Church aren't responsible for fighting with the monsters. At least during the peaceful times when the monsters were attacking the territory, they didn't attack the monsters. There aren't many senior hunters in the 6 consortiums. At least, there are only a few senior hunters on the surface. I don't know if there are any in the dark. But anyway, as long as we go deep into the radiation zone, the possibility of them tracking us is not high. At the same time, Dean glanced at the new hunter who was running beside him. This little guy was really good at making trouble for him. Running to a grassland, a dark green poisonous snake suddenly jumped out of the grass. The color of its body was exactly the same as the grass. Dean's reaction was quick. He was about to make a move, but he didn't raise his hand when he felt a strong wind passing by. The next moment the snake's body was cut off from the middle. The snake's head was still trying to bite him. Whoosh! The new splitter jumped up and pounced on the snake. Its mouth under its abdomen bit the snake and fell on the other side of the grass. Dean glanced at it. He didn't expect the little guy's digestive ability to be so fast. He had a full meal in the stronghold, but now it was hungry again after only half an hour. Dean ran for another 7 or 8 minutes. Suddenly, he saw a vague outline of a building in the lush woods under the mountains in front of the grassland. He was startled and suddenly thought of a possibility. Is it the barbarian's house? His heart pounded as he thought of this. He had never seen the savage who claimed to be an ancestor. It was impossible to say that he wasn't curious. The towering giant wall and the various details made him puzzled. The last time he heard old Foulin talk about the origin of the savage, he had a lot of speculations. Especially when he saw the dagger, there was a creepy feeling in his heart. Dean didn't take a detour and didn't stop. He lowered his body and quietly ran over to take a look. He wanted to sneak closer, but the new splitter didn't care about him. It ran side by side with him. Perhaps it thought that Dean's speed was too slow. It ran around him in circles. It looked very cheerful. Dean smiled in his heart. He didn't dare to say anything, although the little guy didn't show any hostility towards him. But who could predict the changes in the monster's character? Could be fine a second ago, but it could eat you the next second. Soon after, he arrived in front of the forest at the foot of this mountain. He was on guard against the possible attacks of the newborn splitters while sizing up the building behind the forest. Now that he was closer, he immediately discovered that he wasn't mistaken. There was indeed a building in the depths of the forest. Moreover, its style and material were completely different from the houses in the residential area. It was a bit like a concrete building from the olden era. Dean slowly and cautiously went into the woods. The newborn splitter swaggered in. When it was in high spirits, It casually waved its scythe-like arms and cut down some medium-sized trees. The tree trunks fell down and pressed on other small trees. It was extremely conspicuous in the quiet forest. Dean was speechless when he saw such a big movement. Looking at it walking around and cutting down trees, he had a headache and wanted to kick it to death. Chapter 301. When Dean came to the front of the building, he saw that the building had long been a desolate ruin. Lush vines from the window-sill, the door and other places, like a green viper, covered most of the building. Concrete. Dean was startled as he saw the rough cement on the surface of the building. The style of the building was very similar to the houses of the old era. It looked like a small bungalow. However, the color of the cement and the degree of damage on the walls were not as bad as the outside of the wall. It was built by the barbarians? Old Foulin said that the barbarians drank blood. How did they know how to build such a building? Dean was puzzled. Is it the place where the survivors of the catastrophe lived 300 years ago? The descendants of those people all lived here and then left 50 years ago? If a building had been inhabited for more than 200 years, then it was possible to preserve it in good condition. Dean was surprised as he looked at the building hidden in the depths of the woods. He was alarmed when he heard the sound of Splitter approaching. He was relieved as he saw that Splitter didn't have any intention to attack. He stepped on the weeds on the ground and entered the familiar style of the building. Squeak! The door of the building was slowly pushed open and the dust fell. The whole building seemed to be on the verge of collapse. Dean looked around and found some rusty iron locks and animal traps in the room. In addition, there were some simple furniture and beds. Clothes were scattered on the floor, and the furniture was overturned on the ground. It was a mess. It seemed that the owner of the house had turned over the house after he left. Dudian walked in step by step. He pushed open the doors and looked at the rooms inside. Some rooms were empty, without any belongings. They were occupied by moss and vines. There were a few snakes in the corner. When they heard the sound of the door opening, the snakes seemed to know that he was a dangerous existence. They immediately shrank into the gaps in the corners and drilled into the snake hole. Dean retracted his gaze and left the room. He continued to walk into the building. Bang! The new Splitter came in from behind. Its huge body collapsed the door frame. Dean looked back, worried that it would run around and destroy the weak house, burying him alive. He quickly looked around, but didn't see anything strange, so he immediately turned around and left. Bang! At this moment, Dean returned to the living room and was ready to leave. The Splitter's body sank and fell down. The ground under its feet was empty. Is there a basement? Dudian was startled. He quickly rushed over and looked inside. The pitch-black underground did not affect his vision, and he immediately saw a scene that stunned him. There was actually a secret room below, and on the walls of the secret room, there were all kinds of experimental tools and some sharp weapons. In addition, there were also a few huge, experimental tables. Secret laboratory? Dean was startled. He hesitated for a moment but jumped down from the edge of the hole. He landed next to the new Splitter. He opened up a distance from it and looked around. He found that the inside was extremely spacious. It had a diameter of more than 300 square meters. It was equivalent to a small basketball court. Moreover, there seemed to be a corner in front of him that wasn't sealed. Dean was not in a hurry to check, but looked around. He saw 2 experimental tables stained with dried blood. The experimental tables were slanted, and there was a dent of about 20 centimeters on the edge of one of the tables. It seemed that something had hit it, and the steel pipe on the edge of the metal table was pressed into an arc. His nose sniffed and smelled another experiment table covered with a white cloth. It exuded a faint rotten smell and the stench of bones. He was familiar with this smell. It was similar to the monster skeletons that could be seen everywhere in the ruins outside the giant wall. Dean's eyes were dignified. He stepped forward and pulled the white cloth off the table. Crash! The white cloth fell to the ground. The thing on the platform was revealed in front of him. It turned out to be a human skeleton. Dean's eyes flashed as he looked at the human skeleton. The height and shape of the skeleton were no different from an ordinary human. The only difference was that there were two extremely sharp teeth in the mouth of the skeleton. They were much sharper than the general canine teeth. They were about the length of a finger. It was not difficult to imagine the appearance of the skeleton when it was alive. The fangs would reach the chin from the mouth. Fanged people. Dean frowned. He felt that he had strayed into a dark secret. This secret was either related to the virus outside the giant wall or the barbarians. He carefully looked at the skeleton. Except for the fangs, there were no other characteristics. He immediately memorized the characteristics in his mind. He turned around and looked at the other parts of the laboratory. There was a row of huge glass jars. It was often used by biologists to soak biological tissues. The smell of formalin was exuding from the jars. Two of the jars were broken. There was only light green water inside. It was obvious that the water had long been contaminated. The rest of the jars were soaked with tongues, hearts, and other parts. There was even a skin soaked in one of the jars. It was the skin of a human face. Dean slightly frowned. After looking around, he slowly walked towards the corner in front of him. It seemed that the new splitter was quite hungry. It stood in front of the jars and didn't take any action. It seemed that it was sniffing the quality of the food. It paused for a moment and turned away. It didn't touch the things inside the jars. It followed behind Dean. Its scythe-like arms gently rubbed against each other. Dean looked back at the splitter and quickened his pace a little. He didn't want to arouse the beastly nature of the splitter in this dark environment. Soon, Dean came to the corner and saw a corridor leading to another room. Dean was about to step into the corridor when he saw a handled device on the wall. Is there a mechanism? Dean pondered for a moment. He stopped in front of the passage and turned to look at the new splitter. He saw that the new splitter slowly walked over. It also stopped when it saw Dean stop. Dean thought for a moment. He pulled out a piece of dried blood and threw it into the passage. The attention of the new splitter seemed to be attracted by the blood. It looked at the falling blood but still stood motionless. Dean was in a dilemma as he tried to think of other ways. At this time, the new splitter slowly moved forward and entered the passage. Dean's eyes lit up. He quickly grabbed the handle on the wall and pulled it down. Gotcha! Suddenly, the sound of gears turning echoed. A huge iron cage fell from the passage. The position of the cage didn't completely match the place where the new splitter was standing. The edge of the cage pressed against the scythe-like arms of the new splitter. The scythe-like arms shrank back in lightning speed due to the pain. The cage fell to the ground. The new splitter was locked inside. Chapter 302. However, this pleasant surprise was fleeting. The newborn splitter was suddenly trapped by the iron cage. As if it was frightened, it angrily swung its scythe-like arms. With several sharp clanging sounds, the iron cage suddenly broke. Dean's mouth twitched. He knew that he was thinking too much. He slowly retreated so that the latter wouldn't vent its anger on him. However, the newborn splitter obviously did not vent its anger on him. After cutting off the iron cage, it turned around. After seeing that there was no more movement, it walked into the passage. Dean breathed a sigh of relief and followed into the passage. Soon, he came to a spacious laboratory inside the passage. It seemed to be a storage room. There were several dusty shelves on the ground, but the goods on them had been swept away. He looked around and saw a table covered with cobwebs. It looked like a desk, and there was an oil lamp on it. Dean casually opened the drawer under the desk, and a black snake suddenly jumped out. Dean stretched out his hand like lightning and pinched it. His other hand grabbed the snake's tail and pulled it. Bang! The snake was torn into two pieces and thrown to the other side of the wall. The new splitter smelled the blood and rushed over to eat it. Dean opened another drawer and saw a book with a black cover. There were several strange characters on it. They were similar to the giant wall, but there were some differences. Dean picked it up and looked at it. There were many words written on it, but he didn't know any of them. It's not English or Chinese. Is it the characters of other countries? Dean frowned as he turned a few pages. He put away the book. He would go back to see if there were any records of such characters in the superchip. Dean put away the book and glanced around. He saw that there was nothing left. He was slightly disappointed. He looked at the new splitter and saw that it was looking at him. It gently rubbed its scythe arm. Dean had some scruples in his heart. I have to find a way to trap this little guy. I can't kill it, but I don't have the conditions to trap it. If I can communicate with old Fuline, then I can build a cage and lock it inside. But I can't contact old Fuline for the time being. I have to get out of here as soon as possible. I have to help this little guy hunt, or it will be hungry and will likely hunt its own kind. Thinking of this, he sighed in his heart and rubbed his fingers, thinking of a solution. Dean sighed. He could only choose a compromise. It was impossible to trap the newborn splitter. Although he wanted to take it as his own, but the conditions didn't allow him to do so. He could only temporarily release it. With the Holy Church's hunting ability, they won't be able to find it so quickly. Even if they find it, it will be very difficult to kill it. I just need to find it before the Holy Church. If I'm unlucky and the Holy Church finds it first, then I can only hunt the big guy outside the giant wall. Dean secretly made up his mind. Although he knew that it was a bit self-comforting, but at the moment he could only do so. He took a deep look at the newborn splitter, who seemed to be dozing off. He picked up the book and slowly bypassed it, returning from the passage. Before it could catch up with him, he quickly jumped out of the underground laboratory and ran out of the building. Bang! The new splitter also jumped out of the basement. But as soon as it climbed out, it crushed the ground and fell back into it. Dean took the opportunity and quickly ran in one direction. After a few minutes he heard a rustling sound behind him. He looked back and saw the new splitter chasing after him. Dean wasn't surprised. It was difficult for him to win against the latter by speed alone. But it was different with the help of the terrain. Soon, a wild wolf appeared in front of him. After a long period of radiation mutation, this wild wolf's physique was extremely large, like a calf. Its hair was wet and stuck to its body, and its body constantly secreted stinky sweat. The mutated wolf saw Dean, and immediately howled and rushed over. Dean pounced on it head-on. The moment it jumped, he punched its jaw. Bang! The lower jaw bone was broken, and its body flew out. Dean didn't stop. He grabbed its tail and continued to run forward. It didn't take long for him to follow the direction of the smell. He ran to a small lake. A faint fishy smell floated from the lake. The lake water was turbid. He could faintly see a shadow swimming in the dirty water. Dean lifted the mutant wolf and crushed its head with his foot. He completely killed it and smashed it on the ground. The bones in its body were broken. At the same time, a strong smell of blood exuded out. He saw that the shadow in the lake was a bit darker. Apparently, it was attracted by the smell of blood and floated to a higher position under the water. Dean shook the mutant wolf so that its blood spilled into the lake. At this time, the new splitter also caught up. Dean looked back at it and waved the mutant wolf's body. He waited for it to come close before throwing the mutant wolf into the lake. The new splitter immediately stopped by the lake. Dean slowly retreated a few steps and looked at it with vigilance. Puff, puff. At this time, the sound of tumbling echoed from the lake. As the mutant wolf's body fell into the lake, the thing hidden under the dirty water quickly swam out and fiercely fought for the mutant wolf. Occasionally, a black giant tail covered with scales would come out of the water and set off big waves. As the fight at the bottom of the lake became more and more intense, more blood flowed out and the smell of blood became stronger. The new splitter was stimulated by the strong smell of blood. It could no longer hold back and jumped into the lake. Its scythe-like arms quickly moved. The water around its body was quickly dyed red. Apparently, it killed the thing that got close to it. Dean was relieved as he saw this scene. He didn't expect that the splitter wasn't afraid of water. Moreover, it had thin wings. It was simply a tri-habitat monster. Although the size of the wings couldn't support its flight, but it was still a monster with wings. Whoosh! He seized the opportunity to turn around and run. There were a lot of mutant creatures at the bottom of the lake. The new splitter swam in the lake and quickly killed the mutant creatures that attacked it. Soon more than 10 meters of the lake's surface was filled with bright red blood. The waves were surging. It was extremely terrifying. I thought that I couldn't use the lake, so I would use gullies or natural wells. Now it's much easier. But the mutant creatures at the bottom of the lake won't be able to hold me for long. I have to eliminate my smell to get rid of it. Dean picked up some large leaves from the roadside after running for thousands of meters. He scraped the blood off his body and rolled it in the leaf. This was an important thing that could lure the great splitter. He wouldn't exchange it for 1,000 gold coins. As he ran, he scraped the plasma. After scraping out a lump, he pulled out some weeds and rubbed them on his body. First, the weeds could rub off the remaining plasma. Second, the smell of the weed juice could more or less cover the smell of the plasma. Dean looked back after running for more than 10 miles. He saw that the little splitter hadn't chased him. His heart was a little relieved. He followed the smell and found a muddy swamp. He saw several hidden swamp crocodiles. He didn't pay attention to them. He ran to the edge of the swamp and smeared the mud on his body. At this time, the hidden swamp crocodiles slowly swam over. Their 4 or 5 meters long body was quite terrifying, but compared to the more than 10 meters long body of the magic claw crocodile, they looked petite and cute. Dean saw a swamp crocodile slowly approaching him. He pretended to reach out to grab the mud in front of it. Whoosh! The swamp crocodile suddenly opened its bloody mouth and rushed over. Dean was prepared for it. He withdrew his hand like lightning. The swamp crocodile seemed to be stunned as it bit the air. Dean didn't show any mercy. He grabbed its mouth and dragged its body to the shore. He grabbed its upper jaw with one hand and the lower jaw with the other. He fiercely pulled its upper jaw back. The swamp crocodile wanted to take the opportunity to bite him, but as soon as it opened its mouth, its upper jaw was forcefully twisted towards the top of its head, and it continued to be twisted. Suddenly, it broke, and blood spurted out. The swamp crocodile twisted its body in pain. Dudian punched the crocodile's head and stepped on the inside of its jaw. Both of his hands pulled the upper jaw at the same time. Puff! The upper jaw of the swamp crocodile was twisted off. The skin on the skull was torn off. It died on the spot. Dean wasn't polite. He took out the blood from the crocodile's brain and smeared it all over his body to cover up the smell. He immediately abandoned the body of the swamp crocodile. He recalled the previous route of escape. The living area should be in the north and the giant wall should be in the south. He ran at full speed. It shouldn't be able to find me for a while because of the mud and other blood. Dean's eyes flashed. I can only sneak into the city. I have to stay there for another 7 days if I enter the clean guard station. I don't have time to waste there. Moreover, the Holy Church will link the destruction of the barrier and the death of the Knights of Light to me. I'll have to trouble old Foulin to testify that I've been staying in the Ryan Castle. Dean was thinking about the follow-up troubles and countermeasures as he ran. It didn't take long for him to reach the fortress. According to the military reports from the past half a month, the barbarians have attacked Snow City Stronghold and Red Coral Stronghold. Although these two strongholds have been defended, they must be heavily guarded. However, the Desert Rock Stronghold, which is further away from them, should have fewer troops. Dean looked at the fortress from afar. He lurked in the nearby grass and sniffed the smell in the air. Half a minute later, he came out of the grass. Everything was as he expected. He lowered his body and lurked in the middle of the fortress where there was less smell. Chapter 303. Whoosh! It was almost dusk, and the setting sun was shining on the towering rock walls of the fortress. Dean was like a gecko as he climbed along the wall. When he came to the front of the sharp wooden stakes, he saw that the patrolling soldiers on both sides were separated from each other and patrolled to the other side. He quickly jumped into the fortress and rubbed his hands against the wall to slow down the force of his fall. After landing, he rolled over to minimize the sound of his fall. Dean quickly glanced around. He saw that there were several patrolling soldiers in the distance. They were far away from him. He immediately rushed to the other side. He had the experience of smuggling last time, so this time he was more familiar with it. He bypassed the patrols of the guards and came to the desolate wilderness of the fortress. It didn't take long for him to meet a desolate town. I didn't expect that every time I sneak in I would be naked. Dean smiled as he sneaked into the town. He sneaked into the backyard of a house. He stole a set of clothes and put them on. Then he quickly left the town. He took advantage of the darkness and ran towards the direction of Yard Town. A few hours later, Dean arrived at the Yard Town. The sky was dark and the curfew would be coming soon. Dean glanced at the hillside behind the town. The Ryan Castle stood there quietly like a giant beast in the night. Ryan Castle. The study room on the second floor. Sander helped his father to return to his room after dinner. He waited for old Foulin to sit down. Sander took out a thick blanket from the closet and handed it to his father. "It's cold now. Cover yourself with a blanket and sit down." Old Foulin took the blanket and covered his knees. He sighed. "He hasn't come back for so long. I don't know what happened to him." Sander comforted. "Although he is young, but he is mature and cautious. There shouldn't be any big problems. Don't worry. Maybe he will come back in a few days. It doesn't matter if he is mature or immature. The monsters won't talk about these etiquette." Old Foulin shook his head and sighed. Sandro saw his worried face under the lamp and pondered for a while. He said, "Why don't we urge those people to go and take a look? After all, they were bailed out by Mr. Dew. If they don't return this favor, it would be too inhumane. If they are humane, then they won't go to such a dirty place. Even if they are humane, they will be worn out." Old Foulin shook his head. "If there is no news by tomorrow, then find 2 smart people and temporarily put them into hunters. Let them go and see." "Yes." Sander nodded. Old Foulin sighed. "Our Ryan family is rising. Many aristocrats, small aristocrats and well-known rich businessmen want to join our consortium. It seems that we are thriving. But all of this is thanks to him. If we didn't have his identity as an architect, then it wouldn't take long for the Ryan family to return to its original state." Sander was silent for a moment. "Father, we can't rely on him for everything. If he had an accident in the future, wouldn't our whole family decline?" Old Foulin stared at him. "If we don't rise, then how can we talk about decline? I don't want to hear you mention it again in the future." Sander's face slightly changed as he saw his father's anger. "Father, I know I was wrong." Old Foulin slowly recovered his eyes as he saw his father bow his head and apologize. He looked at the burning oil lamp and fell into deep thoughts. His weather-beaten eyes reflected the flames of the lamp. Whoosh! After a moment, a slight sound echoed from outside the window. Old Foulin and Sander were surprised. They looked up and saw a figure dressed like a farmer enter the room. Sander was about to call out "Assassin," but he was stunned as he saw the appearance of the person. "What? Don't you recognize me after changing clothes?" Dean smiled as he came to the table and sat down. He looked at old Foulin. "I made you worry. Did anything happen while I was outside the giant wall?" Old Foulin looked at him. He sighed and smiled. "It's good that you're back. I thought the Mellon family didn't make any movement. I don't know what they are plotting. We don't have any spies. The intelligence is too weak." Dean frowned and thoughtfully nodded. "What about the little guys that I brought back?" "Little guys?" Old Foulin smiled as he heard Dean's name. "They aren't little. One of them is almost as old as me. I've sent people to pay attention to them. Except for the butler Nicholas, the rest of them have been staying in the castle every day. They haven't gone out. Dean raised his eyebrows. What about the butler? Where did he go? He hasn't gone out either. He has been staying in your castle every day. Old Foulin replied. Dean's mouth curved into a smile. I know. I came to nag you tonight. As you can see, I just came back from outside the giant wall. Moreover, I came back illegally. If the Holy Church investigates, you can help me as a witness. You came back illegally? Old Foulin was surprised. You didn't go to the cleaners? Old Foulin patted his head. Yes, I would have gotten the news if I had gone. Why did you come back illegally? Is there something that the Holy Church can't know about? Dean nodded. There was a bit of a mess in the passage. When I came back, I found that a monster had broken through the passage and killed the Knights of Light. I was worried that they would misunderstand that I deliberately let the monster in. So I sneaked into the city so that they wouldn't misunderstand me. I wouldn't have any evidence to explain. Old Foulin and Sander were surprised. They looked at each other. Old Foulin asked, Are you hurt? Did the monster come in by mistake when it was chasing you? Dean shook his head and smiled. I found it when I came back. It's a coincidence that I can't explain it clearly. Old Foulin looked at him. That's right. You are the architect of the Temple of Elements. Your credibility is very high. No one will doubt you if you say that you didn't do it. You don't have to take such risks in the future. Dean said, That's one of the reasons. The second reason is that I don't want to have any relationship with the hunters. Hunters will become my sideline. Even if I go outside the giant wall, I must do it in secret. You should know that the aristocracy discriminates against the hunters and look up to the architects. If I want to maximize the spread of my influence, then I must abandon one aspect. Of course I can't say to abandon it, but to put it in the dark. Old Foulin smiled. I know that you have other reasons. That is your main purpose. I don't need to worry about you. Every time you think about my concerns in advance and do it. My personal suggestion is that you don't need to hunt anymore. You can rely on the money earned from the works to hire others to hunt. You don't need to take the risk yourself. Dean smiled. I know that there must be other reasons. That is your main purpose. You don't need to worry about it. My personal suggestion is that you don't need to hunt anymore. You can rely on the money earned from the works to hire others to hunt. There is no need to take the risk yourself. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.